Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. The night started like any other. I had been at a friend's birthday party in the city, and it was getting late. I don't drink much, but the idea of dealing with the subway at that hour felt exhausting, so I ordered a rideshare to take me home. I'd done it dozens of times before. It felt normal, safe even, to just pull up the app and let someone else do the driving. The car that pulled up was a black sedan, the kind most drivers seem to have. The license plate matched, and the driver, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a friendly smile, waved as I approached. I opened the door and slid into the back seat. The interior smelled faintly of air freshener, something pine-scented, and the radio was playing quietly, some soft jazz I didn't recognize. "Hi, are you Emma?" he asked, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "Yeah, that's me," I replied. "Great. Heading to Maplewood Lane?" "Yes, thanks." He nodded, and we pulled away from the curb. For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. I scrolled through my phone, responding to a few texts and checking the news. The streets were quiet, the kind of calm you only get in the city late at night. But then, I noticed something strange. We weren't heading toward the main road I expected. Instead, he took a turn onto a side street I didn't recognize. At first, I thought maybe it was just a shortcut. Drivers do that sometimes to avoid traffic or get around construction. "Is this a faster way?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately, just gave a vague, "Yeah," something like that. His tone was casual, but there was something about it that felt off. I glanced at my phone, opening the rideshare app to check the route. That's when I noticed the tracker wasn't working. The map, which normally shows the car's movement in real time, was frozen. It showed us still sitting at the pickup spot. "Hey, I think there's something wrong with the app," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced at me in the mirror again, his smile tight. "Yeah, that happens sometimes. Don't worry about it. I know where I'm going." My stomach tightened. Something about the way he said it felt too casual, too dismissive. I watched the streets more closely now, trying to figure out where we were. The buildings were unfamiliar, and the further we went, the fewer streetlights there were. I think you missed a turn," I said, my voice a little firmer this time. "Nah, this is better," he said. "Trust me." I didn't. My heart was starting to race now, and I could feel my palms sweating. I opened the app again, trying to re-enter the destination, but it wouldn't update. The car's motion wasn't showing at all. It was as if we weren't moving. "Can you please just follow the directions in the app?" I asked, trying to sound calm but assertive. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked, "So, you live alone out there, or you got roommates?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. It was so casual, but the implications made my skin crawl. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. He glanced at me again in the mirror. "Quiet type, huh? That's okay. I get it." I forced myself to speak. "I think I'll get out here. I'll just walk the rest of the way." He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Out here? There's nothing around. It's not safe to walk at night, you know." The street we were on was empty, lined with warehouses and the occasional parked car. No houses, no stores, no people. He slowed the car slightly, almost as if to tease me, before speeding up again. I reached for my phone and called the emergency number listed in the app. Nothing. The call didn't connect. It was like my phone wasn't working at all. I tried calling 911 next, and thankfully, it started ringing. The driver noticed. "Who you calling?" he asked, his tone sharper now. I didn't answer, just stared at the screen, willing someone to pick up. The ringing seemed to go on forever, and I felt the panic rising in my chest. Finally, a dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency? I'm in a rideshare, and the driver isn't taking me where I need to go, I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know where I am, and the app isn't tracking the ride. The driver's eyes flicked to the mirror, and his smile was gone now. Who are you talking to? He asked, his voice tight and angry. I ignored him and kept talking to the dispatcher, describing the car, the driver, anything I could think of. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and that they were sending help. The driver's knuckles were white on the steering wheel now. You're making a big deal out of nothing, he said, his voice low but tense. I was just trying to make conversation. I want to get out, I said firmly. Let me out of the car. He didn't answer. Instead, he sped up, taking another turn onto an even darker street. My heart was pounding, and I could barely breathe. I reached for the door handle, but the child locks were on. I was trapped. The dispatcher was still on the line, trying to keep me calm, but I couldn't focus on their words. All I could think about was getting out. Then, as we rounded a corner, I saw headlights ahead. Another car was coming toward us. Without thinking, I started banging on the window, yelling for help. The other car slowed as it passed, and I saw the driver staring at us. The rideshare driver swore under his breath and slammed on the brakes. Fine, he said sharply. Get out. I didn't wait for him to change his mind. As soon as he unlocked the door, I threw it open and jumped out. I stumbled onto the pavement, my knees scraping against the rough ground, but I didn't care. I ran toward the other car, waving my arms. The driver of the other car rolled down their window, and I breathlessly explained what had happened. They let me into their car and drove me straight to the nearest police station. The rideshare driver was caught a few hours later. Turns out, he wasn't even an official driver. He'd stolen someone else's account and had a history of similar incidents. I was lucky to get out when I did. It's been months since that night, and I still can't bring myself to use a rideshare app again. I keep thinking about what could have happened if that other car hadn't been there, if I hadn't managed to call for help. I don't think I'll ever forget the way his voice sounded, the way his smile faded when he realized I wasn't going to stay quiet. I decided to take a hike last weekend. I'd been stressed with work, and the idea of being out in the woods, away from everything, felt like exactly what I needed. I picked a trail in a remote area that wasn't too far from where I lived but wasn't overly popular. I didn't want crowds or noise. Just peace. The weather was perfect, cool and overcast, with a slight breeze. I parked my car at the small gravel lot by the trailhead and noticed only one other vehicle there, a beat-up truck with no plates on the front. That should have stood out more to me, but at the time, it didn't register as anything unusual. I chalked it up to a local hunter or someone who preferred the quiet like I did. The first mile or so was uneventful. The woods were dense, and the trail was narrow, but it was well marked. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. But then, just as the trail dipped into a small valley, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the mud. They were fresh, and they weren't mine. At first, I didn't think much of it. People hike all the time, and maybe whoever left them was ahead of me somewhere. Still, I couldn't help but look closer. The prints were deep, heavier than my own, and spaced in a way that suggested the person was walking at a steady, deliberate pace. I kept going, trying to brush it off. But as I moved, something started to feel off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stopped a few times to listen, but the forest was quiet. Too quiet. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. About 20 minutes later, the trail split into two paths. I decided to take the left one, mostly because it looked less traveled, and I wanted to avoid running into anyone. As I started down it, I glanced back at the footprints in the mud. They veered left too, right where I was going. That was when I started to get uneasy. There hadn't been anyone at the trailhead when I arrived except for that old truck, and I hadn't seen or heard another soul since starting. So who was out here, and why were their prints matching mine? I picked up my pace, trying to put some distance between myself and the thought of someone else being nearby. But every time I glanced back, I saw more footprints, fresh ones, heading in the same direction as me. It was as if whoever it was had sped up when I did. I stopped walking and turned around, scanning the trail behind me. Nothing. Just the trees and the path stretching back up the hill. I stood there for what felt like forever, straining to hear something, anything. But the woods stayed silent. I decided to change direction. I didn't want to head back to the car yet, but I figured cutting across the forest would shake whoever it was, if there even was someone. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the prints were just a coincidence. Still, I veered off the trail, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen branches to avoid leaving obvious tracks. The forest felt different once I was off the trail. The trees were closer together, their branches reaching down like they were trying to trap me. The ground was uneven, covered in moss and leaves, and it was harder to keep my bearings. But I pushed on, determined to lose whatever was making me uneasy. After about 10 minutes, I came to a small clearing and stopped to catch my breath. That's when I saw them again. Footprints. Right in the damp earth at the edge of the clearing. They were fresh, and they were mine, or almost mine. The spacing was too perfect, too deliberate, like someone had been following my exact path. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out here, and they were following me. My first thought was to call for help, but when I pulled out my phone, there was no signal. Of course. It was too remote for any reception. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was a hunter or another hiker, someone who'd taken an interest in my route but didn't mean any harm. But why stay hidden? Why not call out or pass me by? And how had they matched my steps so perfectly? I decided to keep moving. If I stayed still, I'd just give them more time to close in. I cut back toward the trail, keeping my movements quick but quiet. I didn't care about the footprints anymore. I just wanted to get back to my car. The trail felt longer than I remembered, and every step was filled with the nagging sense that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. Just trees, shadows, and the occasional flicker of movement that I couldn't quite place. Finally, I reached the last stretch of the trail. I could see the gravel lot through the trees, and my car was still there. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The truck was gone. I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. The lot was empty except for my car. No sign of anyone else. No sign of the person who'd been following me. I fumbled with my keys, glancing around the lot and the edge of the forest. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I checked my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me. But there was no one. The drive home felt endless. I kept looking at the road behind me, convinced I'd see headlights or a shadowy figure trailing me. But nothing happened. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in the dark, trying to make sense of it all. I haven't gone back to that trail since. I probably never will. I can't stop thinking about the footprints, how they matched mine so perfectly, and how I never once saw the person who left them. Whoever they were, they knew how to stay hidden. And they wanted me to know I wasn't alone. I was driving home late at night after a long shift at work. I work at a warehouse, so my hours are odd, and by the time I leave, it's usually pitch black out. That night, the roads were practically empty, just the occasional set of headlights passing in the other direction. I had the radio off, and the hum of the engine was the only sound keeping me company. I was about 10 minutes from home when I noticed the flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it must be an ambulance or something, so I slowed down and moved over to let them pass. But they didn't pass. The light stayed right behind me, so I realized they were pulling me over. I wasn't speeding or doing anything wrong, so I was confused, but I pulled off to the side of the road. The area was isolated, a stretch of highway bordered by woods on either side. There were no streetlights, just the glow of the patrol car behind me and my own headlights cutting through the darkness. I put my car in park and waited. I could see the outline of a figure in the patrol car behind me, but they didn't get out right away. It was strange. Usually, officers approach pretty quickly, don't they? I started to feel uneasy, but I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. Finally, the door opened and the officer stepped out. Something about him seemed off right away. He wasn't wearing a hat, which I thought was odd, but I figured not every officer does. His silhouette didn't match what I'd expect either. He looked broader, heavier. But it was late, and my eyes could have been playing tricks on me. He approached my window slowly, flashlight in hand, and motioned for me to roll it down. I did, but only halfway, enough to talk. His face was partially shadowed, but I could see he wasn't wearing a typical uniform. His shirt was black, and it didn't have any visible patches or insignias. He had no badge. "License and registration," he said. His voice was flat, almost monotone, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach tighten. I hesitated. "Can I ask what I did wrong?" "You didn't signal a lane change back there," he replied, gesturing vaguely toward the road behind us. His flashlight beam darted across my dashboard and then settled on my face. I knew I'd signaled. I always do. But I didn't want to argue, so I reached over to the glove compartment for my registration. My hands felt shaky as I handed it to him with my license. He took them without a word and stepped back toward his car. I sat there, watching him in my side mirror. He didn't go back to his car. Instead, he stood there, flipping through my documents with one hand while shining the flashlight into the woods with the other. Minutes passed. Too many. It wasn't normal. My unease was growing. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do. Should I ask him if everything was okay? Should I just wait? When he finally came back, he didn't return my documents right away. Instead, he leaned closer to the window. "You're out late," he said, his tone casual but unsettling. "Where are you headed?" "Home," I said, keeping my answer short. "Home, huh?" He tilted his head, studying me. You live around here? Yes. How long have you been working at the warehouse? His question caught me off guard. I hadn't mentioned where I worked. How do you know where I work? My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't help it. My heart was pounding now. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ran your plates, he said simply. Saw the employee sticker on your bumper. That made sense, I guessed, but it still felt off. Everything about this was off. I glanced down at his shirt again. No badge, no name tag, nothing that marked him as an actual officer. My brain started racing. Do you have a badge I can see? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned closer, resting his forearm on the edge of my window. Why? Don't you trust me? His tone was almost mocking now, and the smile on his face widened, but it looked wrong, like he was enjoying my discomfort. I felt trapped. My car was boxed in by his, and we were on an empty stretch of road with no one around. I decided to test him. If I didn't signal, can I see the dash cam footage? You have a dash cam, right? His smile faded. He straightened up, and for the first time, his calm demeanor cracked. You questioning me? He snapped. That was it. That was the moment I knew something was seriously wrong. A real officer wouldn't react like that. My hand inched toward my phone, but before I could grab it, he stepped back and said, "Get out of the car." What? Get out of the car, he repeated, more forcefully this time. Step out now. I froze. Every instinct in me screamed not to open that door. I'm sorry, I said, stalling. I don't feel safe. I'd like to call your station to confirm. Get out of the car, he shouted, slamming his palm against the roof. My whole body jolted, and my mind went blank for a second. Then I snapped into action. I hit the lock button on my door, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. As soon as the operator answered, I spoke fast and loud. I'm being pulled over on Route 47 by someone claiming to be an officer. I don't think he's real. Please send help. The man outside heard me. His expression changed, and for a split second, he looked unsure. Then, without a word, he turned and walked briskly back to his car. I stayed on the line with the operator, giving her my location and describing the man and his vehicle. As I watched in my mirror, his car sped off into the night, the red and blue lights flickering off as he disappeared around a bend. When the real police arrived, I was still shaking. They took my statement and assured me they'd look into it, but I could tell by the looks on their faces that they'd heard similar stories before. They told me I'd done the right thing by not getting out of the car and by calling for help. It's been a few days now, and I can't stop thinking about it. Who was he? What would have happened if I'd opened that door? I don't want to know. I'll never drive that stretch of road at night again. The store was busier than I expected for a weekday. I'd gone in just to grab a few shirts and maybe a new pair of jeans, nothing special, but the racks were packed with people flipping through hangers like it was a holiday sale. The fluorescent lights overhead were bright, the kind that made everything look a little washed out, and the music playing from the speakers was just loud enough to be distracting. I found a couple of shirts and a pair of jeans that seemed like they'd fit, so I headed to the dressing rooms at the back of the store. The attendant, a girl who couldn't have been much older than 19, looked bored out of her mind. She was leaning against the counter, scrolling on her phone, and barely glanced at me as I walked up. 3 items, I said, holding them up. She nodded, handed me a plastic number with 3 printed on it, and waved me toward the rooms without saying a word. The dressing rooms were empty, which I liked. There were 6 stalls, 3 on each side of a narrow hallway, with full-length mirrors at the end. I chose the first stall on the left, turned the lock, and hung my clothes on the hook inside. The room was small, just big enough for the bench, a mirror, and a little space to turn around. The walls didn't go all the way to the floor, and I could hear faint footsteps from the sales floor outside. I tried on the first shirt. It was a little snug in the shoulders, but it looked decent. I was checking myself out in the mirror when I thought I heard something like a faint shuffle, almost like someone brushing against the door. I paused and listened. Nothing. I chalked it up to my imagination and kept going. The second shirt was better, and the jeans fit perfectly. I decided to buy all 3 items and started getting dressed again. That's when I noticed something strange. The lock. It wouldn't turn. I jiggled it a little, thinking maybe it was stuck, but it didn't budge. I twisted harder, using both hands, but it was like it was jammed in place. "Hey," I called out, hoping the attendant would hear me. The lock stuck. No response. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. I crouched down to peek under the door, expecting to see the girl's legs or someone else walking by, but the hallway was empty. Okay, I thought. No big deal. Locks get stuck sometimes. I pulled out my phone and was about to call the store's front desk when the overhead lights flickered. Then they went out completely. I froze. The room was pitch black. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. "Hello?" I shouted, louder now, panic creeping into my voice. The store's music had stopped too. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear if anyone was out there, but it was dead silent. I banged on the door. "Hey! I'm stuck in here." No answer. My heart was racing. I banged harder, shouting as loud as I could, but the door didn't budge, and no one came. I don't know how long I stood there, pounding on the door and yelling. It felt like forever. My throat was raw, and my fists were sore from hitting the wood. I tried the lock again, twisting it with everything I had, but it didn't move. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming down the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, desperate. "I'm in here." The door stuck. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. Relief flooded through me. "Thank God," I said. "Can you help me get out?" There was no response. "Hello?" I repeated, my voice trembling. Still nothing. I crouched down again, peering under the door, but whoever was out there wasn't standing close enough for me to see their feet. A cold, creeping fear settled in my chest. "This isn't funny," I said, my voice shaking. "If you're messing with me, just stop." The footsteps started again, but this time they were moving away. "Wait!" I shouted. "Don't go!" But they didn't stop. They faded down the hall until I couldn't hear them anymore. I was shaking now, barely able to keep my grip on my phone. I tried dialing the store's number, but there was no signal. That didn't make any sense. I had full bars when I walked in. I tried again. Nothing. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, trying to figure out what to do. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe the attendant had gone on break and didn't realize I was in here. Maybe there was a power outage and the staff was trying to fix it. But none of that explained the footsteps. Then I heard it. A faint scratching sound. It was coming from the wall behind me. I spun around, pressing my back against the door, and stared into the darkness. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like nails scraping against wood. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. The silence was deafening. Then, without warning, the lights flickered back on. I blinked, disoriented by the sudden brightness. The room looked the same as before, small, cramped, and empty. But something felt different. I turned to the door and tried the lock again. This time, it turned easily. The door swung open, and I stumbled into the hallway, expecting to see the attendant or someone from the store. The hallway was empty. The counter where the attendant had been was abandoned, and the rest of the dressing rooms were open and unoccupied. I hurried back to the sales floor, my heart pounding. The store was as busy as it had been when I arrived, people browsing racks and chatting like nothing had happened. I went straight to the front desk and told the cashier what had happened. She frowned and called the dressing room attendant over. The girl looked confused. "I didn't see anyone go in there," she said. "I thought all the rooms were empty." I insisted I'd been in there, that I'd gotten stuck and heard someone outside the door. She shook her head. "I don't know what to tell you. I was at the counter the whole time, and no one came back there. I left without buying anything. I couldn't get out of that store fast enough. I don't know what happened in that dressing room, and honestly, I don't want to know. I just know I'm never going back to that store again." The move was supposed to be a fresh start. Our family needed it. The neighborhood seemed perfect, quiet streets, neat lawns, and friendly neighbors. On the first day, while we were unloading the truck, a man from across the street came over to introduce himself. He looked to be in his late 50s, tall and wiry, with a neatly trimmed beard and a wide smile. He held a pie in his hands, saying it was a welcome gift. His name was Mr. Clark. "It's such a nice area," he said. "You'll love it here. Everyone looks out for each other." We thanked him, and he lingered for a while, chatting about the neighborhood. He pointed out other houses, telling us who lived where. He seemed kind, maybe a little too interested, but I brushed it off. He was just being friendly, I thought. Over the next couple of weeks, we saw him often. Mr. Clark would wave whenever we were outside, and he'd sometimes wander over to talk. He always seemed to know what was going on, like when our Wi-Fi wasn't working one morning. "Must be the line," he said, walking over as I struggled with my phone on the porch. "Happens sometimes. I can call the utility company for you if you want." I told him it wasn't necessary, but he stayed a little too long, asking about what kind of work I did, how old our kids were, and if we had any plans for the weekend. His questions felt polite at first, but there was something about the way he asked them, like he was trying to piece something together. One evening, my wife noticed him standing in his yard. It was nearly midnight, and he wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking in our direction. "Do you think he's all right?" she asked. I shrugged. Probably just taking a walk or something. But he wasn't walking. He stayed there for at least 15 minutes before finally going back inside. The next day, I saw him again, this time in the morning. He was leaning on the fence between our yards, watching as our kids played in the backyard. I stepped outside to talk to him, trying to be polite but firm. "Everything okay, Mr. Clark?" I asked. He smiled, that same wide grin from the first day. "Oh, just enjoying the morning. You've got a lovely family." I nodded, not sure how to respond. He stayed there for a few minutes before walking back to his house. As the weeks went by, the sightings became more frequent. Late at night, early in the morning, even in the middle of the afternoon, he'd be there, standing in his yard, on the sidewalk, or near the fence, always facing our house. It started to feel less like friendliness and more like surveillance. One night, I was taking out the trash when I noticed him standing at the edge of our driveway. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there, watching. "Mr. Clark," I called out. "Do you need something?" He didn't respond right away, but after a long pause, he said, "Just making sure everything's okay over here." That was the first time I felt genuinely uneasy. My wife suggested we install some cameras. It seemed extreme at first, but I agreed. We set up a few around the house, one by the front door, one in the backyard, and another covering the driveway. The first night after we installed them, I checked the footage out of curiosity. It was mostly empty frames, just the occasional car passing by or a raccoon in the yard. But at around 2 a.m., the backyard camera caught him. He was standing just outside our fence, staring toward the house. I woke my wife, and we watched the clip together. She wanted to call the police, but I wasn't sure what we'd say. He hadn't done anything illegal, at least not yet. The next day, I confronted him. "Mr. Clark, I saw you in our yard last night," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. His smile didn't waver. "Just checking on things. You never know what kind of people might be around." I told him we didn't need anyone checking on us and asked him to stay off our property. He nodded but didn't seem bothered. That night, I checked the cameras again. Around 3 a.m., he was there, this time on our back porch. He stood by the door for several minutes, looking through the glass, before stepping back and walking away. My heart was racing as I watched the footage. This wasn't just weird anymore, it was a threat. I called the police, and they sent someone over to take a report. The officer was polite but didn't seem too concerned. "Without any actual damage or forced entry, there's not much we can do," he said. I showed him the footage, and he agreed to talk to Mr. Clark. The next day, I saw a patrol car parked outside his house. The officers were inside for about 20 minutes before leaving. Mr. Clark came out afterward, smiling and waving like nothing had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump, every shadow seemed like him. Around 4 a.m., I finally drifted off, only to be woken by the sound of the backyard camera alert. I grabbed my phone and opened the app. He was on the porch again, this time trying the handle. I didn't hesitate. I called 911 and stayed on the line until the police arrived. They caught him still in the yard. He didn't resist, didn't even try to explain himself. They took him away, and we got a restraining order the next day. I don't know what his intentions were, and I don't want to know. We've added more cameras, stronger locks, and motion lights. But even now, months later, I still wake up in the middle of the night, half expecting to see him standing there. It started out small, something I almost didn't notice at first. After my evening workouts at the gym, I'd see the same men hanging around the parking lot. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. The gym wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't the worst either. There were a few businesses nearby, and I assumed he was waiting for someone. He wasn't particularly striking, medium build, plain clothes, dark hair. The kind of person you wouldn't give a second glance to. The first couple of times, he was just there, leaning against a car or standing near the streetlight, looking at his phone. I didn't think much of it. But then I realized he was always there. It didn't matter what time I finished my workout, early evening, late at night, even on weekends, he was in the lot. He never came into the gym, never seemed to interact with anyone. Just stood there, always in the same general area. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he lived nearby, or maybe his car was broken down and he was waiting for help. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. One night, after a particularly late session, I came out of the gym to find the lot mostly empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, flickering glow. He was there again, standing near the same spot, just a little too close to my car. I hesitated, lingering near the gym entrance. My keys were in my hand, gripped tightly, the small canister of pepper spray dangling from the ring. He wasn't looking at his phone this time. He was watching me. I took a deep breath and started walking. The sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet lot. I avoided eye contact, keeping my head down, but I could feel his gaze. As I got closer to my car, he moved. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to keep calm. "Can I help you?" He smiled, a strange, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've seen you around here. Just wanted to say hi." I stopped a few feet from my car, keeping the vehicle between us. "Okay. Hi." His smile didn't waver. "You're here a lot. You must be really dedicated." I didn't know what to say to that. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to end the conversation without escalating it. "I guess," I said, glancing toward the gym. The front desk was empty. The girl who usually worked nights must have stepped out. "You don't have to be nervous," he said, taking a step closer. I tightened my grip on my keys, the pepper spray pressing into my palm. "I'm not nervous." He laughed, a low, uncomfortable sound. "I just thought maybe we could talk. You know, get to know each other. You're always in such a rush." "I need to go," I said firmly, taking a step toward my car door. He moved again, positioning himself closer, cutting off my path. "Just a few minutes." "What's the harm?" The smile was still there, but there was something in his eyes now, something sharp, predatory. I didn't answer. Instead, I unlocked my car with the fob and opened the door just enough to wedge myself between it and the frame. His expression changed, the smile slipping for a fraction of a second. "Hey, I'm just being friendly. No need to be rude." I slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors before he could say anything else. He stayed there, standing just outside my window, his face unreadable. For a moment, I thought he was going to walk away. But then he leaned down, his hands on the edge of the window. "You don't have to be like that," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. I started the engine, the sound cutting through the silence. His eyes didn't move from mine. As I pulled out of the parking spot, he stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. I drove out of the lot as quickly as I could, my hands trembling on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching me go. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I called the gym and reported what happened. The manager assured me they'd look into it, maybe even review the security footage, but I didn't feel reassured. For the next week, I changed my routine, going to the gym at different times. But every time, I found myself scanning the parking lot, my stomach twisting into knots when I didn't see him and twisting even tighter when I did. It wasn't until a Friday night that things escalated. I had just finished my workout and was heading to my car when I noticed him again. This time, he wasn't standing near the lot. He was sitting in a car, parked a few spaces away from mine. As I walked past, the engine started. I didn't look at him, didn't slow down. My heart was racing, every nerve on edge. I got into my car and locked the doors, my fingers fumbling with the keys as I started the engine. The headlights of his car turned on. I pulled out of the lot, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. He followed. At first, I told myself it was another coincidence. But as I made turn after turn, he stayed behind me, always at a distance but never too far. I drove aimlessly, trying to lose him, but no matter where I went, he was there. Finally, I spotted a gas station up ahead, brightly lit with a few cars in the lot. I pulled in, parking as close to the entrance as I could. He drove past, his car slowing just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. I stayed in the station for almost half an hour, pretending to browse the shelves. When I finally got back to my car, he was gone. That was the last time I saw him, but it hasn't stopped me from looking over my shoulder, from checking the parking lot every time I leave the gym. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know I'll never forget the look in his eyes. It was late, almost midnight, and the highway was nearly empty. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home after visiting my sister. The radio was playing softly, and the rhythmic hum of the tires was almost hypnotic. The stretch of road I was on was surrounded by nothing but dark fields, the occasional faint glow of a farmhouse in the distance. I saw him before I fully registered what was happening. A man standing on the shoulder of the road, waving his arms. His car was pulled over just ahead of him, hazard lights flashing. He looked frantic, almost desperate. For a second, I debated what to do. It was late, and I was alone. But the part of me that didn't want to leave someone stranded won out. I slowed down and pulled over a few feet ahead of his car. I left my engine running and rolled my window down just enough to speak without fully opening myself up. He jogged up to the passenger side, his hands in the air like he wanted to show he wasn't a threat. "Thank you," he said, leaning slightly to talk through the crack in the window. His face was shadowed, but I could make out short, dark hair and the kind of features that didn't stand out much. "My car won't start, and my phone's dead. Can you help me?" I hesitated. He didn't look dangerous, but something about his tone was off, too urgent, too practiced. My instincts told me to be careful. "What's wrong with your car?" I asked. "Battery, I think," he said quickly. "I just need a jump. Please, I've been out here for hours." I glanced at his car. It was an older model sedan, the kind that might genuinely have trouble. But the highway was wide, and I didn't see any other cars around. The nearest exit was miles back. Something didn't add up. "I don't have jumper cables," I said, keeping my voice calm. "But I can call for help if you want." His face shifted just for a second, but enough for me to catch it. The desperation faded, replaced by something harder, colder. "No need," he said, his voice suddenly flat. "Just step out of the car, and we'll figure it out." My heart skipped. "What?" He didn't repeat himself. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. The barrel was small, but it might as well have been a cannon pointed at me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought the leather would tear. "Get out," he said, quieter this time but no less menacing. "Leave the keys." My brain was racing. I had heard stories about situations like this, but I never thought I'd be in one. Every instinct told me to floor it, but his hand on the gun was steady. I didn't doubt he'd use it. "I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Just take whatever you want." I said, "Get out." His tone sharpened, and he took a step closer to the car. He wasn't bluffing. I nodded slowly, my mind working overtime. If I got out, he'd have control. But if I stayed, he'd shoot. My eyes flicked to the side mirror, scanning the highway. Still empty. No headlights, no help. I took a deep breath. "Okay," I said, my voice steady. "I'm getting out." I reached for the door handle, but instead of opening it, I slammed the lock button and hit the gas. The tires screeched, the sudden acceleration throwing me back against the seat. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumble backward, raising the gun. There was a loud crack, and my passenger side window shattered. Glass sprayed across the seat, and the sound of the shot echoed in my ears. I swerved instinctively, the car jerking wildly as I fought to regain control. Another shot rang out, but I didn't look back. I kept my foot on the gas, the speedometer climbing as the dark highway stretched ahead of me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The air was filled with the smell of burnt rubber and the sharp metallic tang of adrenaline. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I realized I was crying. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. The shattered window whistled as the wind rushed through, the cold air biting at my face. I didn't stop until I saw the glowing lights of a truck stop in the distance. Pulling into the lot, I parked near the entrance, surrounded by big rigs and a few other cars. My body felt like it was moving on autopilot as I got out and stumbled inside. The cashier looked up from her magazine, her eyes widening as she took in my disheveled state. "Are you okay?" she asked. I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. "Call the police." It wasn't until I was sitting in the back of a patrol car, giving my statement to an officer, that I finally felt a small sense of safety. They said they'd send a car to check the area where it happened, but I knew he'd be long gone. People like that didn't stick around. The officer offered to follow me home, but I declined. I didn't want to drive alone, not that night, but I couldn't face the thought of going back down that highway either. I stayed at a motel near the truck stop, the door locked and bolted, a chair shoved under the handle. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard the crack of the gun, felt the glass cutting into my skin. It's been weeks now, but I still can't drive at night. Every time I see a car pulled over, my chest tightens. I think about what might have happened if I'd gotten out of the car. How easily it could have ended differently. I'll never stop on the side of the road again. No matter how desperate someone looks, no matter how much they seem to need help. Because now I know what's out there. The train car was mostly empty. It was late, past midnight, and I was heading home after a long shift. I liked riding the train at night. It was quiet, and I could finally let my mind wander. There were only a handful of people scattered around the car, all lost in their own worlds. A man with headphones a few rows ahead of me, a woman in a corner seat scrolling through her phone, and another man sitting diagonally across from me with a notebook in his lap. At first, I didn't notice him. I was staring out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks against the darkness. But something pulled my attention back. The sound of a pen scratching paper. Not unusual, but it felt persistent, deliberate. I glanced over and saw him hunched over the notebook, his hand moving quickly. He was middle-aged, maybe late 40s, with unkempt hair and a faded jacket. Nothing about him stood out, but the way he was focused on that notebook made me curious. I shifted in my seat to get a better look, but he turned the page before I could make out what he was drawing. His eyes flicked up and met mine for a split second before dropping back down to his notebook. Something about that glance made my skin prickle. I told myself it was nothing. People draw in public all the time. Maybe he was an artist, or just someone passing the time. But then I noticed something strange. The angle of his notebook was tilted toward me, like he wanted me to see but also didn't. It felt intentional. I turned my attention back to the window, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. But I couldn't ignore it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him lift his head again, his gaze settling on me before quickly looking away. When the train slowed at the next station, I made a decision. I grabbed my bag, stood up, and moved to the next car. It wasn't far, just through the connecting doors, but it felt safer putting some distance between us. The new car was even emptier, just one man in a suit sleeping against the window. I took a seat near the middle, where I could see both exits. The train jerked forward, and I leaned back, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But then the door at the end of the car slid open. I looked up and felt my stomach drop. It was him. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around like he was deciding where to sit. He walked straight down the aisle and took a seat a few rows behind me. I could feel his eyes on the back of my head, and my hands clenched around the strap of my bag. I told myself I was imagining things. He could have just been moving cars for the same reason I had. Maybe he wanted more space, or maybe he didn't like the vibe in the last car. But it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. The train stopped again, and I decided to test it. I stood up, walked to the door, and stepped into the next car. This one was brighter, with more people. A couple chatting quietly, a man reading a book. I sat near the door, keeping my eyes on the connecting passage. It didn't take long. A minute later, the door slid open, and he stepped through. His eyes scanned the car until they landed on me. He didn't even pretend to look for another seat. He just sat down, closer this time, just 2 rows behind me. My heart was pounding now. I fumbled with my phone, opening a message thread and typing out a quick text to my roommate. There's a guy following me on the train. What do I do? I hit send and waited, staring at the screen like it was a lifeline. She didn't reply right away, and I didn't know if she was asleep or if the message hadn't gone through. The train rattled on, the hum of the tracks filling the silence. I could feel his gaze, even though I didn't turn around to check. The next station came into view, and I made a split-second decision. When the doors opened, I stepped off the train. I didn't plan to leave, I just wanted to see if he would follow. The platform was empty except for a janitor sweeping near the stairs. I stayed close to the edge, watching the doors. For a moment, I thought maybe I was wrong, that he would stay on the train and this would all just be a weird story to laugh about later. But then he stepped off. He stood on the platform, his notebook tucked under his arm. He didn't approach me, didn't say anything, just stood there watching. The doors closed behind him, and the train pulled away, leaving us in silence. I backed toward the stairs, my pulse racing. Can I help you? I finally managed to say, my voice shaking. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my question. Then he opened the notebook and turned it toward me. The pages were filled with sketches. My face, my posture, even the way I had been sitting by the window. Page after page, all of me. I felt frozen, my legs refusing to move. Why are you doing this? I asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled, closed the notebook, and took a step forward. I bolted. My legs finally worked, and I ran up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. I didn't look back until I reached the street, my lungs burning and my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. When I turned, he wasn't there. The platform was empty, the station eerily quiet. I didn't stop running until I reached a gas station a few blocks away. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, breathless and disheveled. "Call the police," I said, my voice cracking. "There's a man following me." They came quickly, but by the time they searched the station, he was gone. I filed a report, described him as best as I could, but they didn't seem hopeful. "These things happen," one of the officers said, like it was supposed to make me feel better. I didn't sleep that night. Or the night after. It's been weeks, and I can't stop thinking about that notebook. About how many sketches there were. About how long he must have been watching me. I still take the train, but never alone. And I always sit near the conductor's car, where there are people around. But every time I hear the sound of a pen scratching paper, I feel my chest tighten, and I can't help but look over my shoulder. We hired a tutor for our son a few months ago. He's 9, and while he's smart, he was falling behind in math and reading. My wife and I both work full-time, so we decided having someone come to the house would be easier than shuttling him back and forth to a learning center. We found Mark through an online service. His profile was impressive: years of experience, glowing reviews, even a background in child psychology. He seemed perfect. Mark came to meet us before his first session, and everything felt right. He was friendly, professional, and great with our son, Ethan. He stayed about an hour, discussing his approach and going over Ethan's needs. We felt confident leaving him with Ethan for the first session later that week. The lesson started off well. Ethan seemed to enjoy working with Mark, which was a relief. He even started bringing his math homework to the dinner table to show us what he'd learned. We were thrilled and thought we'd found the perfect fit. It wasn't until a few weeks in that things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle. Mark would ask questions that didn't seem related to tutoring. "Do you and your wife both work late?" he asked one evening as I walked him to the door. I thought he was just making conversation, so I answered without much thought. Then, during another session, he casually asked if we had any travel plans coming up. Again, I didn't think much of it. People ask those kinds of questions all the time. But then he started asking Ethan similar things. "What time does your mom usually get home? Do you ever stay home by yourself?" Ethan mentioned it to us one night, laughing because he thought the questions were weird. My wife and I exchanged a look but decided not to jump to conclusions. Maybe Mark was just trying to connect with Ethan, we thought. Then small items began to go missing. It was little things at first: loose change from the counter, a pack of gum, a cheap pen set my wife kept near the phone. We joked about it, blaming each other or Ethan. "Stop stealing my pens," my wife said, laughing. Ethan swore he hadn't touched them, and I believed him. But then the missing items started to add up. A set of spare keys we kept in the kitchen drawer vanished. A pair of earrings my wife left on the bathroom sink disappeared. Even one of my watches, a cheap one I wore for work, was gone. We turned the house upside down looking for these things but found nothing. It wasn't until my wife noticed her jewelry box slightly out of place on her dresser that we started to piece things together. The box wasn't where she usually left it, and when she opened it, she swore a necklace was missing. "I think Mark might be stealing from us," she said one night after Ethan had gone to bed. I wanted to dismiss it, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. He was the only person who'd been in the house regularly besides us. But why? He didn't seem like the type. He was polite, punctual, and great with Ethan. What motive could he possibly have? We decided to test our theory. The next time Mark came over, We left a few $20 bills on the kitchen counter, partially hidden under some mail. We made sure to step out of the room a couple of times during the session, giving him the opportunity to take them. After he left, we checked. The money was gone. My stomach dropped. My wife was livid. We wanted to confront him right away, but we were also nervous about making accusations without solid proof. What if we were wrong? What if Ethan got caught in the middle of something ugly? We decided to install a small camera in the living room where most of the tutoring sessions took place. It was discreet, hidden among some books on the shelf. We figured if he was taking anything, we'd catch him in the act. The next session, we acted like everything was normal. Mark came in, greeted Ethan, and started the lesson while we pretended to work in the other room. After he left, we immediately checked the footage. What we saw made my blood run cold. Mark wasn't just tutoring. While Ethan was focused on his workbook, Mark kept glancing around the room, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. At one point, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook. He started writing in it, looking up occasionally at Ethan and around the room. When Ethan got up to use the bathroom, Mark stood and started walking around the living room. He opened a cabinet, rifled through some papers, and even peeked into a box we kept on the shelf. He didn't take anything this time, at least not that we could see, but the intent was clear. He was snooping. We were furious but also scared. What was he looking for? Was he planning to steal more? Or worse? We decided to call the police. They advised us to cancel the next session and avoid confrontation. They'd come to the house to take a report and review the footage. When we told Mark we wouldn't need his services anymore, his reaction chilled me. He didn't argue or ask why. He just smiled and said, "I understand. If you ever change your mind, feel free to reach out." The police came the next day and took our statement. They said they'd look into Mark's background and see if he'd been reported for similar behavior. In the meantime, we changed our locks and added security cameras around the house. We also warned Ethan never to open the door to anyone he didn't know, even if they claimed to be a friend. A few days later, the police called with an update. Mark had a record, nothing major, just a few misdemeanors for theft and trespassing. But it was enough to confirm our suspicions. They said they tried to locate him for questioning but didn't think we were in immediate danger. Still, I can't shake the feeling that we dodged a bullet. Every time I hear a car pull into the driveway or see someone walking past the house, my heart races. I can't help but wonder what might have happened if we hadn't noticed the signs. We're more careful now, especially about who we let into our home. Ethan's doing fine, he's caught up in school and doesn't seem too bothered by what happened. But my wife and I can't stop thinking about how close we came to letting a stranger into our lives who clearly had his own agenda. We never heard from Mark again, and honestly, I hope we never do. We had been looking for a tutor for our son, Liam, for a while. He's always been a bright kid, but lately, his grades were slipping, especially in math. We both work full-time, and we thought hiring a tutor would give him the extra help he needed to catch up. We found someone through an online service, a woman named Claire. She had excellent reviews, and her background was impressive. She'd been a teacher for over 10 years and had worked with kids of all ages. She seemed like the perfect fit. The first few sessions went smoothly. Claire was professional, friendly, and very patient with Liam. She came to our house twice a week, and every time, she was on time, well prepared, and stayed the full hour. Liam seemed to be enjoying it, too. He'd talk about the lessons afterward, and we noticed that his attitude toward homework was improving. But then, little things started to change. At first, it wasn't anything that stood out too much. She'd ask questions that were slightly off, but we didn't think much of it. "What time do you guys usually get home from work?" she asked one day as we were wrapping up a lesson. I answered, telling her that my wife and I typically get in around 6:30 p.m. It seemed like a harmless question at the time. But then, over the next couple of weeks, she asked about our routines more and more. "Do you go out often on weekends? How long do you usually spend doing groceries?" It started to feel a little invasive, but I shrugged it off. Maybe she was just trying to build rapport with Liam, trying to understand his home life better so she could connect with him more. But as time went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then came the first instance of something disappearing. One morning, I went to get my car keys from the kitchen counter, and they were gone. I asked my wife if she had moved them. She said she hadn't. I searched the house, thinking I had misplaced them, but I couldn't find them anywhere. I figured I must have been more tired than I thought, so I let it go. A few days later, it happened again. This time, it was a pair of earrings my wife had left on the bathroom counter. She couldn't find them. She swore she hadn't touched them, and I was starting to feel unsettled. The feeling of something being off in the house, something I couldn't put my finger on, was growing. Then there were the other things. Small things, like my watch going missing or the TV remote vanishing for a day or two. Sometimes, we find things in odd places, like a book that was left on the shelf suddenly turned up on the kitchen table. I didn't say anything to my wife at first, but she noticed too. But it was the day Liam came to me with something that really made my heart race. He was looking through his backpack when he found something strange, a small notebook. It wasn't his, and it wasn't anything we bought. It had a few pages torn out, and some scribbled notes inside. But what caught my attention was the handwriting. It was Claire's. She had written about Liam's progress in the tutoring sessions, yes, but she'd also written down personal details about me and my wife, even about the house. "They usually leave at 8 a.m., one note said. "Their car is always in the driveway by 6:30 p.m. There were other things too, details that she couldn't have known unless she had been paying close attention, things that went beyond the tutoring sessions. That was when I started connecting the dots. The weird questions, the missing things, the notebook, everything pointed to Claire. She was more than just a tutor. She was watching us. She was taking notes on our lives. We decided to install a security camera in the living room. It wasn't anything too obvious, just a small, hidden camera that would blend in with the decor. I felt like we had no choice. We needed proof. The next time Claire came for a lesson, we pretended everything was normal. I acted like nothing was wrong, but my mind was racing. When I reviewed the footage that night, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Claire had come in, and after a few minutes of tutoring, she started looking around the room. She wasn't paying attention to Liam anymore. She was glancing at the shelves, the counters, the little knickknacks my wife and I had collected over the years. She was even taking mental notes about the places she visited in the house. It was like she was mapping it all out. Then, as she got up to help Liam with something, I saw her glance at the counter where we kept our spare keys. She moved toward it, hesitated, then reached for them. She picked them up, looked at them for a moment, and put them in her bag. That was the moment I knew we had to confront her. We couldn't let it go any longer. I called my wife, and we talked it over. We agreed that we would cancel the next lesson. I'd be home, and I'd confront Claire directly. We didn't want to make it a scene, but we needed to know what was going on. The next day, I texted her and told her we were no longer in need of her services. She responded quickly, thanking us for the opportunity and asking if she could return to pick up her materials. I didn't respond right away, but I was on edge. That night, When Claire arrived to pick up her things, she acted completely normal. She smiled, asked how we were doing, and made small talk. She didn't act like she'd done anything wrong. But when I asked her if she had taken anything from our house, her face went pale. She stammered a little, then said, "What do you mean?" I didn't give her a chance to explain. I asked her directly about the notebook, about the keys, and the missing items. At first, she denied it. But when I told her I had seen the footage, her demeanor changed completely. She became defensive, insisting she had only been looking around because she was curious. She apologized, but there was something in her eyes, something cold, that made me feel uneasy. I told her to leave, and she did. The next day, we called the police. They took the notebook, the camera footage, and statements from us. They told us they'd look into it, but we haven't heard from them since. I don't know if she had any intention of stealing from us or if she was just obsessed with our lives, but I'm glad we found out before things got worse. We've changed the locks and added extra security to the house. Liam's doing better in school, but I'm still not completely comfortable. I'm constantly checking everything now, wondering if we missed anything else. What if there's more we don't know? The worst part is that I don't know why she did it. What was she trying to get from us? What was her end game? The uncertainty is the hardest part to deal with. I'll never forget that day. It seemed like just another normal morning for a jog in the park, but everything changed the moment I stepped off the familiar trail. It was about 7 a.m. when I started my run. I've always enjoyed early morning jogs. It's peaceful, and the park is usually quiet at that hour. The air is crisp, the sun is just starting to rise, and there's something about the solitude that helps me clear my mind. It's always been a safe space, a place where I could just be. I know the paths by heart, the ones around the lake and the ones that loop through the wooded areas. It's never been a place where I felt nervous or concerned. As I passed the entrance to the wooded trail, I saw a man standing just off the path. He was pacing back and forth, looking down at the ground, seemingly anxious. I thought nothing of it at first. I'd seen other joggers and walkers before, so I kept going. But then I heard him call out, "Hey, excuse me. Can you help me out for a second?" I slowed my pace, not sure what he wanted. I looked over and saw that he was holding a leash, but there was no dog in sight. "Sure, what's up?" I asked, now slowing to a walk. "I lost my dog," he said. "I was walking him, and he ran off. I can't find him. Have you seen any dogs around here?" At first, I thought it was just an unfortunate situation. It happens. Dogs sometimes run off unexpectedly. The man looked distressed, but not overly panicked. I've always been a dog lover myself, so I felt a little bad for him. I figured I could help. "No, I haven't seen one," I told him, "but I can keep an eye out if you'd like. I'm headed down this trail. Maybe I can help you find him." He nodded quickly. "That would be great. I've been walking for a while, but I haven't had any luck." He didn't seem dangerous at first. Just a guy who'd lost his dog. I figured he'd be fine if I kept jogging and offered to keep an eye out while I did so. I knew the area well, and I didn't mind trying to help someone. The man fell in step beside me as we walked down the trail. I didn't think much of it at first. We chatted about random things, mostly small talk. He mentioned his dog was a golden retriever, which made me smile. I love those dogs. But then his questions started to shift. "So, how far do you live from here?" he asked, his voice a little too curious. I was caught off guard. It wasn't an unusual question in itself. Lots of people make small talk about where they live, but his tone made me uneasy. There was a subtle edge to it, like he was trying to find out more about me. "Oh, not far," I said, a bit cautiously, "just a couple miles from here." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. He just nodded and then asked another question, this time more pointed. "And who's waiting for you at home?" he asked, a little too innocently. I stopped for a moment, looking at him more closely. Something about the way he asked felt wrong. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something more unsettling. He was asking questions that didn't seem to fit into a casual conversation. It felt like he was trying to gather information, to map out my life. "Just my roommate," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Why?" He gave a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Just wondering." He said it so offhandedly, like it was a normal thing to ask a stranger. By now, I started to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make a scene. We were deep in the woods now, far from the path where I could see the park's entrance. My jog had taken me much further from the familiar routes, and I didn't want to make any assumptions, but it was becoming harder to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. Then, he asked again. "So, how far do you live again?" This time, his question felt different, like he was measuring something, not just casually making conversation. I was still trying to brush it off as nothing, but the same pit in my stomach told me to pay more attention. "Like I said, not far. Just a couple miles," I replied, my tone now slightly sharper. He nodded again, but this time, he didn't speak right away. He just kept walking beside me, the silence hanging between us. I tried to push away the worry creeping in, but the more I walked, the more uncomfortable I felt. I kept thinking of the exit from the trail, but it felt too far. There was no one else around, and the trail was narrowing. Suddenly, I noticed that his pace had quickened. Without realizing it, I'd fallen behind a few steps. He looked over his shoulder, and for the first time, his expression was completely different. His face was taut, his eyes narrowed slightly as if he were sizing me up. It wasn't friendly anymore. It wasn't worried about his dog. It was predatory. I felt my heart beat faster. A little voice inside told me to be alert. I glanced around. I could hear the birds in the trees, the sound of the wind, but there was no one else on the trail. No one to see if anything went wrong. I had to get out of here. I started walking faster, hoping he would fall behind, but he matched my pace. He wasn't close enough to grab me, but I could feel him just behind me now. I turned slightly, trying to gauge the distance between us. "I really need to find my dog," he said quietly, almost too quietly, like he was trying to draw my attention again. "Can you help me look around this corner?" I stopped abruptly. "No. I need to get going," I said, turning back toward the path we had just come from. "I'm sorry, but I can't help anymore." I could feel his eyes on me. He didn't say anything, but he didn't move either. I was backing up now, my instincts kicking in, screaming at me to turn around and run. "I'll just leave you to your dog then," I added quickly, trying to put as much space between us as possible. And that's when he stopped following. He stood there, still and silent, watching me with that cold, calculating gaze, and for the briefest moment, I thought he might take a step toward me. But instead, he just stood there, his face expressionless. I didn't give him another moment. I turned and ran, as fast as I could, until I broke free of the trees and was back on the main path. I kept running until I was near the parking lot where a couple of joggers had gathered, and only then did I slow down. I didn't look back once. I didn't tell anyone at first. I thought it might have been a coincidence, that I was overreacting. But I can't forget the way his eyes looked at me, how he asked those questions that no one should ask a stranger in the woods. I don't know what his intentions were, but I'm sure glad I didn't find out. I haven't been back to that part of the park since. I had just finished a long day at work and wanted to grab a few things from the grocery store before heading home. It was late in the evening, around 8:30 p.m., and the store was quieter than usual, with only a handful of people scattered around the aisles. I was tired but just trying to get in and out as quickly as possible. I didn't think much of the empty shelves or the dimmed lights, just focused on my list and getting home. As I moved through the aisles, something caught my eye. A man was walking just a few paces behind me. I didn't pay much attention at first. It wasn't unusual to see people in the same aisles when you're picking out groceries. But then it happened again. I rounded the corner to the next aisle, and so did he, right behind me, just a few feet away. It wasn't anything too obvious, but I started to feel watched. A little uncomfortable. I picked up a box of cereal and glanced over my shoulder. He was still there. Not directly looking at me, but I could feel his presence. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I moved on, heading towards the produce section. I reached for some tomatoes and noticed him again, only this time he was standing a little too close to me. I could feel the air shift, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly looked down at my cart, pretending to rummage through it. He was still there, and this time, it wasn't subtle. I kept telling myself to stay calm. This was a grocery store, after all. People shop, and maybe he was just trying to pick up some items too. But the way he was lingering was starting to feel wrong. I didn't recognize him from the store, and I couldn't remember seeing him earlier in the aisles. I kept glancing around the store, trying to see if anyone else had noticed him, but no one seemed to be paying attention. It was just the two of us, and I began to feel like I was trapped in some kind of vacuum, the space around me growing smaller with every step I took. I grabbed what I needed, trying to keep moving, trying to stay focused on my list. But each time I turned down a new aisle, there he was always just a few steps behind. Sometimes he would stop, pretending to look at a shelf, and then start walking again when I did. At one point, I reached for a bag of flour, and when I straightened up, he was right there. Too close. "Excuse me," I muttered, trying to sound confident, though my voice was shaking slightly. He just smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was unsettling, almost as if he knew something I didn't. "Sorry," he said, his voice flat. He stepped aside, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than was comfortable before he moved to the next aisle. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart started pounding in my chest. I hurried to finish my shopping, grabbing the last few items as quickly as I could, trying not to glance back. I just wanted to get to the checkout, get out of there, and go home. When I finally made my way to the register, I noticed the man again, standing in line a few spots behind me. This time, I made sure not to look back at him, but I could feel his presence, like a shadow on the back of my neck. I paid quickly, practically running through the checkout process. The cashier didn't seem to notice anything, or maybe they were just too busy with their own work. I didn't care. I left the store, trying to stay calm, to look casual. My mind was racing, and I could hear my footsteps echoing on the pavement as I walked to my car. It wasn't until I reached the end of the row that I saw him again, standing by his car, just a few spots over from mine. My stomach dropped. I couldn't remember what kind of car he drove, but there it was, a sedan with tinted windows, parked next to my own. I didn't know for sure if he was waiting for me, but something told me that he was. I stopped in my tracks. I didn't want to seem like I was panicking, but I could feel the dread creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't just go back into the store. I couldn't go back to the register and make a scene. I needed to get to my car, but I was too scared to walk towards it now. I stood there for a moment, pretending to adjust my purse and looking around to see if anyone else was still in the parking lot. The place was nearly empty now. I could see a couple of cars far off in the distance, but no one close. The parking lot was eerily quiet. My pulse was thudding in my ears. I checked my phone quickly, no messages. No calls. I glanced back at the man. He was still standing there, facing away from me, but I knew he had to have seen me by now. He hadn't gotten into his car. He hadn't moved an inch. Just waiting. Watching. I thought about calling someone, but my hands were shaking. I didn't want to make any rash decisions and risk alerting him that I was onto him. I tried to breathe through the anxiety rising in my chest. I could feel the panic beginning to build, but I forced myself to move. Slowly, I stepped back toward my car, making my way down the row of vehicles, keeping my eyes fixed ahead of me. I felt like every step took forever. When I was just a few feet away from my car, I hesitated. Was he really going to do something? Was he just waiting for me to get close enough? I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I had to get in my car, fast. I reached for my keys, keeping my eyes fixed on his car. I unlocked the door and slid inside, locking it immediately. My hands were still shaking, and I could barely get the key into the ignition. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but the parking lot was empty. He wasn't there anymore. My heart was racing in my chest as I finally started the engine and backed out of the space. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. It wasn't until I got inside my apartment and locked the door that I felt like I could breathe again. But even then, I kept thinking about that man. The way he followed me, the way he just stood there waiting by his car. The sick feeling in my stomach didn't go away until well into the night. I didn't go out again alone for the next few days. I stayed home, and even when I did go out, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching me. I don't know if that man was just looking for someone to talk to or if he had other intentions, but I wasn't willing to stick around long enough to find out. I've always considered myself a fairly aware person, someone who trusts their instincts when something feels off. But that doesn't mean I'm always right. And it certainly didn't help me the day I encountered the man at my front door. It started as an ordinary Thursday. I was working from home that day, sitting at my desk with my headphones in, trying to power through a stack of emails. The neighborhood was quiet, as it usually is in the middle of the day. There weren't many cars driving by, and most people were at work. I didn't expect any interruptions, but of course, life rarely goes as planned. I was just about to open my email inbox when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated. I checked the time. It was just past noon, and no one usually stopped by unannounced. Still, I figured it was maybe a delivery, or perhaps someone from the neighborhood with a question. I got up and peeked through the peephole. There was a man standing on my porch, holding a clipboard. He was dressed in dark blue work clothes that looked official, with a utility company's logo on the sleeve. At least, that's what I thought I saw from the peephole. I opened the door slightly, keeping the chain lock on. "Hello?" I asked, not fully opening it. "Good afternoon," the man said in a calm, neutral voice. I'm from the gas company. We're conducting some routine safety checks in the area, and there's been a report of a gas leak nearby. Just want to make sure everything's good on your end. Mind if I come in for a few minutes to check your system? His demeanor seemed normal enough, nothing overtly suspicious. In fact, he even looked polite, like someone doing his job. I briefly wondered if maybe it was just some routine maintenance or if they were trying to get everyone's systems up to code. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I don't know if it was the way he looked at me, or how quickly he rattled off his explanation. But my gut told me to be cautious. However, I told myself I was overthinking it. I had utility workers in my house before, and they all had done their jobs without issue. So, against my better judgment, I nodded. Sure, okay, I said, opening the door wider. Just give me a second. I went to take the chain lock off, but before I could, he pushed the door open slightly more, just enough to slip inside. He didn't rush in, but he didn't wait for an invitation either. Thanks, he said, as though he'd been invited in already. His voice had shifted slightly, and it made me tense up. I couldn't explain it. Something wasn't right. I'll just need a minute, I said, trying to keep my composure. I just need to grab my phone, and I'll be right with you. I was hoping to buy some time. Maybe I could call the utility company to double check, but as I turned to walk into the living room, I heard the sound of the door clicking shut behind me. My heart skipped. It wasn't the usual sound of the door closing, it was unmistakably the sound of the door locking. I spun around quickly, already feeling a cold rush of panic. The man was standing there, looking calm, almost too calm. Is everything all right? You seem a little tense. My blood turned cold. What do you mean, the door is locked? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Just a precaution, he said with a half smile, though there was no real warmth behind it. You wouldn't want any issues with your gas, would you? He took a step further into the house without waiting for an answer. I wasn't sure what to do, but my instinct screamed at me to get out, to get away from him, to run. I knew the door was locked behind me, and I had no idea if he had locked it himself or if he had some key. Can you please unlock the door? I asked, trying to stay calm. He ignored me, continuing to step further inside like he was familiar with the house. Just wanted to check a few things. He moved past me, into the kitchen. I could feel the air in the room shift, the tension building in my chest. I told myself I was overreacting, but my gut was telling me something else entirely. He opened the kitchen cabinets and began to inspect them, as if it was part of his job. It was too odd. The gas lines were outside, right? Why would he need to look around the house? I stared at him, trying to come up with a plan. Was this guy really a worker, or was something far worse happening? I needed to do something, anything, to get control of the situation. But what? I didn't want to confront him directly, not when I had no idea what he could do. I could tell he wasn't acting normal anymore. His actions were deliberate and methodical. He wasn't here to check the gas. He was here for something else. I took a step toward the door, my hand brushing against the wall as I prepared to make a break for it. But before I could move, he turned to face me. I should probably check upstairs, he said, with that same unsettling calm. You wouldn't want any surprises, right? I froze. My pulse quickened. My mind was racing. I had to stop him from going upstairs. He couldn't get to the second floor, where my bedroom was, where I kept my phone. No, I said, a little too firmly. No, there's no need to go upstairs. I have a gas detector in the basement. It's just down there. It's fine. He looked at me for a second, then smiled again, but this time, it wasn't friendly at all. If you say so, he said, his voice dropping lower. I'll just have a quick look upstairs. You know, for safety. I was done. This wasn't happening. I made a quick decision. Without saying another word, I turned and bolted for the front door. I had to get out. I had to get away from this man. As I reached the door, I fumbled with the lock, trying to turn it. I heard him behind me, his footsteps quickening, but I didn't dare turn around. The door finally opened, and I stumbled out onto the porch, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's house, pounding on their door with everything I had. They let me in, and I quickly explained what had happened. My neighbor, thankfully, called the police immediately. The man never came back, and the police couldn't find any sign of him when they checked the area, but they assured me that he wasn't a utility worker. He didn't have any identification. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I learned my lesson that day. You don't just trust anyone who knocks at your door, no matter what they claim. And you definitely don't let them inside. I've taken extra precautions since then. Deadbolts, security cameras, and a new routine. I can't risk that feeling again. I just wish I knew what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. It started out as a regular trip, or so I thought. I had a work conference in a small city, and after looking through dozens of hotel options, I decided to rent an Airbnb for the weekend. I'd used the platform before, and everything always went smoothly. So, when I booked the place, I assumed I'd have a quiet, hassle-free stay. The listing was simple enough, just a cozy, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The photos looked fine, and the reviews were decent, but nothing extraordinary. Still, the price was right, and it seemed like a comfortable place to crash after long days at the conference. I arrived late on a Thursday evening. The host, a man in his 40s named Andrew, was very polite when I arrived, which made sense since it's common for hosts to meet guests personally. He showed me around the apartment, gave me a quick rundown of the house rules, and explained how to use the keyless entry system. Everything seemed normal at first. He seemed friendly, almost overly accommodating. I brushed it off as just someone eager to make a good impression. He left shortly after the tour, saying if I needed anything, I could reach him through the Airbnb app or by phone. That was the last time I saw him that night. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it at the conference, only returning to the apartment in the evenings to relax and rest. But by the time Friday rolled around, things started to feel a little off. Around 11 a.m., I was sitting at the kitchen table, answering emails and sipping my coffee when I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole, and to my surprise, it was Andrew. I opened the door, confused but polite. "Hey, Andrew, everything okay?" I asked. "Oh, yeah, everything's fine," he said with a smile. "I just realized I forgot to drop off an extra set of towels for you. I'm really sorry about that. I wasn't bothered by it at first." He seemed to be in a hurry, and I assumed it was just a small oversight. He quickly handed me the towels and apologized again. I thanked him, and he left. But later that afternoon, I noticed something strange. I had been working in the living room, and when I walked into the kitchen, I saw that the cabinets were slightly ajar. It was a small detail, but it made me uneasy. I was sure I'd closed them when I made lunch earlier, but I didn't think much of it. The real trouble started that evening. I had just come back from the conference, and I was planning to have a quiet night in. It was around 7 p.m. when there was another knock at the door. I opened it, and this time, Andrew was standing there, looking a little too casual. "Hey, sorry to bother you again," he said, not meeting my eyes. I was wondering if I could just quickly check the water heater. We've been having some issues with it lately, and I need to make sure everything's running smoothly. I felt a sudden wave of discomfort wash over me. It seemed like an odd request, especially for a problem that didn't affect my stay. "Is everything okay with it?" "I didn't notice anything wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Andrew seemed a bit too insistent. "It'll only take a minute," he said, then added, just a quick check to be sure." I was uncomfortable, but I didn't want to cause any trouble. I figured maybe he was just trying to be responsible. So, reluctantly, I stepped aside to let him in. He wandered into the hallway, but I stood in the doorway of the living room, keeping a close eye on him. He spent a little too long by the water heater, more time than I thought was necessary. But he eventually finished and said everything was fine. He thanked me for my patience, then left without another word. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I locked all the doors and made sure the windows were secure. But still, I felt uneasy. I kept thinking about his odd behavior, how he seemed too eager, how he kept showing up unannounced for things that could have easily waited. Saturday passed uneventfully, but I made sure to keep the door locked and the blind shut, just in case. I had a feeling Andrew wouldn't just leave me alone. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Around 2 p.m. the next day, there was another knock. This time, I was already on edge. I checked the peephole before opening the door, and it was Andrew again. He had a smile on his face, but something about it looked forced. "Hey, I was just wondering if I could get in the backyard for a few minutes to check on the garden," he asked casually. "The plants have been needing some attention, and I'd like to make sure everything's good for the next guests." I frowned, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You can do that later, right?" "I'm really busy right now," I said, trying to keep my tone polite but firm. He hesitated for a moment, then took a step closer to the door. "It won't take long, I promise. I just need to check the garden." His tone shifted, becoming more insistent. The way he stood so close to the door made me feel trapped. I wasn't about to let him in, but something in his eyes made me question if I should have said anything at all. I stepped back and said, "Sorry, but I don't feel comfortable with that. I've already had you in here twice today." Andrew's smile faltered for just a second, and he stepped back, but he didn't leave immediately. He stood there for a few moments, watching me with a strange look in his eyes. "All right," he finally said, almost too calmly. "But if you need anything, I'm just down the street." I shut the door before he could say anything else. By now, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't explain why, but my gut was telling me I needed to leave. That night, I contacted Airbnb customer service and told them everything that had been happening. They assured me they'd take care of it, but I wasn't sure what that meant. The next morning, I decided to check out early. I didn't want to be in that apartment anymore, not with the constant interruptions, the feeling of being watched, and Andrew's increasingly erratic behavior. I packed up my things, returned the keys, and left. I was already planning to book a hotel for the rest of my trip. But before I left the neighborhood, I took one last look at the apartment from my car. And that's when I saw Andrew, standing in the window of the living room, watching me leave. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. But I do know that I'll never trust a stranger showing up uninvited again. And I certainly won't forget the unsettling feeling of having someone watch me like that, without reason or explanation. It was a Thursday evening when I decided to treat myself to dinner at this little Italian restaurant I had passed by a few times but never actually entered. The place had that rustic charm about it, dim lighting, wooden tables, and a faint smell of garlic in the air. I had been feeling kind of down that week, so I figured a quiet meal alone might be just what I needed. I didn't mind dining alone. It was peaceful, and sometimes I needed that solitude. I walked into the restaurant, the bell above the door jingling softly as I entered. The host greeted me with a smile and showed me to a table for one near the window. It was a small spot, tucked away in the corner, but I liked it. The view of the street was nice, and I felt content to just sit there and unwind. The restaurant wasn't too busy. It was the tail end of dinner rush hour, and most people were already finishing up or on their way out. The dim light made everything feel cozy. I had no reason to be suspicious or feel uncomfortable until I noticed him. He was sitting at a table 2 spots away, alone as well, but I wasn't paying him much attention at first. I ordered my meal, sipped my wine, and browsed my phone to kill time while I waited. I could feel the hum of the place, the murmur of conversations around me, but nothing stood out as unusual. That is, until the waiter came by with something that wasn't my order. He placed a folded napkin next to my plate, and I furrowed my brow. It was a note. From the gentleman at the table, the waiter said, motioning to the man I had noticed earlier. I wasn't sure how to respond. I had no idea who this person was, and it felt odd to receive a note from someone I had never spoken to. Still, I decided to open it out of curiosity. The note was simple, written in neat handwriting. I know you. You should come join me. It's not good to dine alone. I read it twice, and my stomach dropped. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and I had no idea what he meant by I know you. It was unsettling, but I tried to shake it off. I wasn't going to make a scene, so I just glanced over at the man. He was sitting back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him, looking directly at me with an unsettling calmness. I immediately felt uncomfortable. Something wasn't right. But I didn't want to seem rude, so I smiled politely and shook my head, signaling that I wasn't interested. I hoped that would be the end of it. The waiter returned to clear some plates from the nearby table, and I took that moment to quickly finish my wine and my meal. I didn't want to stay there any longer, but I also didn't want to make a scene by just getting up and leaving. I kept my eyes on the man as I discreetly glanced his way. He was still looking at me, his expression unchanged. I waited a few more minutes, hoping he would lose interest. But then I saw him stand up and walk toward the door. I thought maybe he was leaving, but as he stepped outside, he paused and looked back toward the restaurant, his eyes meeting mine once more. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain why, but I had this sinking feeling that something wasn't right. I quickly paid my bill, grabbed my bag, and made my way to the door. As I stepped outside, I felt the weight of the cool evening air hit my face. I glanced around, thinking that maybe I had misjudged the situation, that perhaps he was just another diner with too much time on his hands. But when I turned to leave, I saw him again, standing across the street, watching me. I wasn't sure if he was waiting for me to leave, or if it was just a coincidence. But the way he stood there, unmoving, his eyes locked onto me, made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off as nothing more than a weird feeling. Maybe he wasn't even aware that I noticed him. I made my way down the block toward my car, my pace quickening, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My car was parked a few blocks away, and I tried not to look back as I walked. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every step I took, I felt his gaze on the back of my neck. As I approached my car, I glanced up and saw him again, still across the street, standing under the dim light of a street lamp. He was just standing there, staring at me. I quickly unlocked my car, threw open the door and slid inside, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I put the key in the ignition. I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting him to be standing right behind me. But he wasn't. He was still across the street, still watching me. I didn't want to risk taking the usual route home, so I drove around the block, making sure to avoid any roads that could lead me near the restaurant again. As I turned down an unfamiliar street, I glanced in the side mirror once more. I couldn't help it. And that's when I saw it. The man was following me in his car, keeping a few blocks behind, but it was unmistakable. It was the same car he had parked earlier, dark, nondescript, and now tailing me. My heart raced. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I couldn't breathe. I drove faster, trying to stay calm, trying to figure out what to do. My mind raced as I turned onto another street, hoping to lose him. But he kept following. No matter how many turns I made, how much I tried to shake him off, he kept pace with me. I didn't want to lead him to my house, but I had no other choice. I couldn't keep driving forever. So, when I reached a well-lit area near my neighborhood, I turned onto a main road, hoping that I could somehow find help. I pulled into a gas station and parked in a brightly lit area near the entrance, hoping to be noticed by someone. I waited in my car, watching the street. A few minutes passed. Then, the car I had been worried about passed by slowly, but it didn't stop. I waited a while longer before driving the rest of the way home, my heart still pounding in my chest. I kept checking my rearview mirror, but he was nowhere to be seen. I arrived home safely, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I went online to check the restaurant's reviews, looking for any signs of anything similar happening to other customers. To my surprise, I found a comment from a woman who mentioned something similar, a man who had left an unsettling note on her table, asking her to join him. It wasn't a coincidence. I haven't gone back to that restaurant. I still don't know who he was or why he acted the way he did, but I know I won't forget that night. I'm just grateful nothing worse happened. It started like any other night. My friends and I had gone to a party at a house just off campus. It was the usual thing, loud music, red cups, and people laughing a little too loudly. Nothing out of the ordinary. I'd been to 100 parties like this before. You show up, you talk to people, maybe you drink a little, then you go home. Simple. That's how I met him, Ethan. He was standing by the kitchen counter when I walked in, talking to a couple of people I didn't know. I wasn't really looking to meet anyone, but he smiled and waved me over. I figured, why not? Maybe I'd find someone to talk to, maybe even make a new friend. I was new to the area, and most of my time was spent either in class or studying, so getting out was a nice change. Ethan was charming. Not in the way that made you feel like he was trying too hard, but just enough to make you feel comfortable. He had a friendly smile, a laid-back vibe, and we had some mutual friends. We started talking, and the conversation just flowed. He wasn't pushy or intense, but there was something about him that kept pulling me in. He asked where I was from, why I was studying, and we chatted about campus life. At first, everything felt completely normal. He made me laugh, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. But as the night went on, I started noticing something. It wasn't anything huge, just little things that felt off. Every time I tried to walk away to talk to someone else, he'd follow me, like he didn't want to be separated. He would keep reappearing in the same places, even when I hadn't seen him for a while. After a few hours, I was ready to leave. I didn't know anyone very well at the party, and I wasn't in the mood to stay up late. I said goodbye to my friends and started heading for the door. But as I walked past the kitchen, there was Ethan again. He must have noticed I was leaving, because he immediately started walking toward me. "Hey, don't leave yet," he said, his voice a little too eager. I paused, feeling a little awkward. "I think I'm done for the night." "It's been fun, though." He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made me hesitate. "I get it, but we should hang out sometime. Maybe grab a coffee? What's your number?" At that point, I was starting to feel uncomfortable. He seemed nice, but there was something about the way he kept asking that felt a little too intense. Still, I didn't want to be rude, so I gave him my number. It wasn't a big deal at first. He texted me the next day, saying he had a good time at the party and asking if I wanted to meet up for coffee sometime. I didn't think much of it. I responded, and we set a time. I went to the coffee shop, thinking it would just be a casual hangout. When I showed up, he was already there. We had a good time, at least, at first. He was easy to talk to, and I thought maybe I'd been reading too much into things. Maybe he was just a little clingy. We talked about our classes, campus events, and the usual small talk. But as the conversation went on, he started asking questions that felt a little too personal. "So, what are you doing later? Are you living in the dorms? Is it just you there?" I tried to brush it off, telling him I didn't have any big plans, just homework. But he kept pushing, asking about my roommates, about my schedule, and how often I was out. It started to feel invasive. I politely told him I had to go, and as I was leaving, he walked me to the door. "Hey, I'll walk you back to your dorm. It's not safe for a girl to be out here alone." I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to make him feel bad, but I also didn't want him to think I needed him to walk me back. So I told him I'd be fine and gave a half-hearted excuse about being in a rush. He smiled but didn't push it, which was a small relief. Over the next few weeks, things got weirder. Ethan started showing up outside my classes. I'd be walking to a lecture, and there he'd be, just standing there, waiting. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. But when I saw him the third time, I started to feel uneasy. He'd wave, walk up, and ask if I was heading to lunch, or if I had time to grab a coffee. It wasn't just in the classroom building. He'd pop up outside the library, or near the student center. Once, I had just finished a study session, and when I walked out, I saw him standing by a bench, looking around like he was waiting for someone. I was about to turn the other way when he spotted me and waved me over. At first, I thought maybe he just enjoyed talking to me, but I started to get this strange feeling. It wasn't just his constant appearances, it was how he acted when he saw me. He'd act like we were the best of friends, but it felt forced. Like he was trying too hard to convince me we were close. One evening, I came back to my dorm after a long day of classes, and when I opened the door to my room, I froze. I could have sworn I saw someone's shadow move past the window. I stepped back quickly and looked around. My heart started pounding. I hadn't seen Ethan in a few days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was him. I checked the peephole on the door, but it was empty. Still, I couldn't relax. I didn't want to assume the worst, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. I didn't see him again for a few days after that, but when I did, he was waiting outside my dorm building. I couldn't help but feel like he was watching me. It didn't take long for my friends to notice, either. I'd mentioned the weird occurrences, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. They assured me it was probably nothing, but the more time passed, the more convinced I was that something was off. I started avoiding the places I knew Ethan might show up. I changed the times I'd leave for class, took a longer route when I went to the library, and even started taking the bus instead of walking. But then, one day, while I was on my way back from the grocery store, I turned the corner to see Ethan standing across the street from my dorm. He was just standing there, staring. My heart dropped into my stomach. I quickly ducked behind a nearby car, hoping he hadn't seen me, but when I looked up again, he was gone. The next day, I didn't go to class. I called my mom and told her everything that had been happening. She was concerned, of course. She urged me to report him, but I was hesitant. What if I was overreacting? What if he was just being friendly? That evening, I got a text from Ethan, the first in a few days. It was short, but it made my skin crawl. I see you're avoiding me. I'll be outside your dorm at 8. We need to talk. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked his number and made a plan to speak with campus security the next day. I never saw him again, at least not in the same way. It started like any other renovation project. I had just bought my first home, a little place on the edge of town, and it needed a lot of work. The floors were creaky, the walls were covered in old wallpaper, and the kitchen was stuck in the 90s. But I loved the potential it had, and I was excited to start turning it into something that felt like mine. I hired a local contractor that came highly recommended. The company had decent reviews, and I figured it would be a good fit. They gave me an estimate, went over the work, and within a week, I had a crew come in to start the renovations. For the most part, everything went smoothly. The workers were polite, they showed up on time, and they did what they were supposed to do. It was messy, of course, but that's to be expected with any renovation. I was living in the house while the work was going on, and most of the workers didn't bother me too much, apart from the occasional noise or them asking where to put something. They'd work until late afternoon, and then they'd leave. But then there was Jeff. Jeff was one of the contractors who seemed to take a little longer with his work. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a big house, and I assumed he was just being thorough. He was probably in his mid-30s, average height, dark hair, and a bit of a rough look to him, but he wasn't rude. He just lingered. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I would leave the house to run errands or go to work, and Jeff would still be there, working. He'd tell me, just want to finish up for the day, or I'm almost done with this part, and then I'll be out of your way. It wasn't the worst thing in the world, but after a while, it started to feel odd. I never saw the others stick around as long as he did, and honestly, I started to get a little uncomfortable. The first red flag came about 2 weeks into the renovation. I came back early from the store, and I was shocked to find Jeff still in the house, long after everyone else had left. The other contractors were gone for the day, and the house was quiet. I walked in through the back door, and there he was, standing in the kitchen with his back to me. He was alone, surrounded by piles of tools and some debris from where they'd ripped out the cabinets. "Hey, Jeff. You still here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned around and gave me a sheepish smile. "Yeah, just wanted to finish the trim in the kitchen. Thought I could knock it out while everyone was gone." I nodded, but something in the way he said it didn't sit right with me. "Okay, well, be careful with those nails," I said, trying to keep it light. "You don't want to hit a pipe or something." "Don't worry," he said, a little too quickly. "I know what I'm doing. Just need a few more minutes." He didn't leave until about an hour later. I was already getting dinner ready by then, and I figured it was just part of the process. But then, over the next few days, the same thing kept happening. I'd come home, and Jeff would be there, working alone. Sometimes, I'd see him when I got home from errands. Other times, I'd hear him moving around in the house, long after the others had left. One evening, I came back from work later than usual, and when I walked through the front door, I saw that the lights were on in the living room, even though I'd been expecting the house to be empty. At first, I thought maybe I'd left a light on by mistake, but then I saw Jeff standing by the windowsill, staring out the front of the house. "Jeff!" I called out, a little louder this time, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Oh, hey," he said, as if nothing was unusual. "I didn't mean to startle you. Just thought I'd finish up the last of the painting." I stared at him for a moment. "It's late. Don't you think you should go home?" He didn't immediately respond. He just stood there, his eyes meeting mine for a moment before he finally nodded. Yeah, I'll head out soon. Just need to clean up a bit, and I'll be gone." I didn't like it. I didn't like that he was here at such a late hour, especially without telling me. I told myself I was probably overreacting, maybe he just wanted to get the job done. But every time I saw him lingering after hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I stayed home to work from the house. I had a few meetings, and I figured it would be a good chance to observe the progress without leaving for long stretches of time. By midday, most of the crew had packed up and left, and I was alone in the house with just Jeff there, as usual. He told me he needed to finish up a few things in the bathroom, so I stayed in my office, trying to focus on work. About an hour later, I got up to grab some water and noticed that the bathroom door was closed, which I thought was odd. I hadn't heard any work being done for a while, and I figured he had left for the day. But when I walked past the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing heavily, like they were trying to be quiet. I froze, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, but it didn't sound like normal work noises. I waited for a moment, holding my breath, but it was dead quiet again. After a few seconds, I knocked lightly on the door. "Jeff," I called, trying to sound calm, though my voice was shaky. "Everything okay in there?" There was a pause, followed by a quiet, "Yeah, just making sure the floor's level. I'll be done soon." I wanted to ask him why he was still here, why he was taking so long, but instead, I just nodded and went back to my office. The next day, things got worse. Jeff was still staying late, but this time, he started leaving things in the house. Tools, a bag of cement, a few paint cans, nothing huge, but it was strange. When I asked him about it, he said he was just storing stuff overnight. That was when I decided to call the contractor and check in. I hadn't mentioned any of my concerns to the contractor before, figuring I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't take it anymore. I explained the situation, and they assured me it was a mistake, that Jeff was probably just working overtime and forgot to clean up. They promised to send someone else the next day to make sure the job was on track. The next day, the foreman came to inspect the house. When we walked into the kitchen, I was horrified to see that the kitchen windows had been left open, even though the crew always locked everything up before leaving. And then I noticed something even more disturbing. Jeff's tools were scattered around the yard, just lying there. They weren't where they had been left the night before. I called the police. I didn't know what was going on, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. When they came to question Jeff, he acted strangely. He kept saying he was just trying to finish the work, but he didn't have a reasonable explanation for why he'd stayed late or left tools behind. When they went through his bag, they found nothing of interest, but that didn't make me feel any better. I never saw Jeff again after that. The foreman assured me that he'd been let go, but I wasn't convinced. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something was wrong that night. I never found out why he stayed so late, or what he was really doing when I wasn't around. I don't know why I didn't think twice about it. Maybe it was the fact that I was just trying to get rid of an old camera I didn't use anymore. Or maybe it was the excitement of making a little extra cash. Either way, I ended up agreeing to meet the buyer in a parking lot late one afternoon to finalize the sale. Looking back, it was stupid. I'd listed the camera on one of those buy-sell groups online. It wasn't anything fancy, just an older model, but I figured someone would want it for a good price. The buyer seemed interested right away. His name was Jake. He messaged me asking if the camera was still available, and after a few quick back-and-forth messages, we agreed to meet up. I gave him the address of a small parking lot near a strip mall. It wasn't too busy, but it was public enough that I thought nothing of it. The day of the meeting came, and I had the camera packed up, ready to go. I got in my car and drove to the lot. As I pulled in, I saw a car already parked near the corner. It wasn't the one Jake had told me he'd be in, but I figured he had arrived early or parked elsewhere. I parked a few spaces away, keeping the camera bag with me. I sent him a quick message to let him know I had arrived, and he replied almost immediately, saying he was on his way and would be there in a minute. I was feeling good, thinking this was all going smoothly. Maybe a little too smooth. I saw a guy approaching my car, and I figured that was Jake. He was tall, wearing a hoodie, and he had a nervous energy about him. He walked up to my passenger side window and knocked on it. I rolled it down. "Hey, you Jake?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, man," he replied. "You got the camera?" I nodded, holding it up. "All set. Just like we talked about." He grinned, but there was something off about it. Cool. Mind if I check it out first? I've got to make sure it works." I handed it to him, still feeling confident that this was all above board. But then, just as he took the camera, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. 2 more guys had walked up to the car, one on each side. They were standing close, like they were trying to block me in. I froze for a second, my heart starting to race. I felt the air change, thick with tension. It was like something clicked in my head, and all of a sudden, everything didn't feel right anymore. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice trembling a little more than I intended. Jake didn't answer right away. He just kept looking at the camera, turning it over in his hands. The 2 others didn't say anything either. They just stood there, arms crossed, staring at me. That's when I realized they were all way too calm for a normal transaction. Then Jake looked up from the camera, and I saw it, the shift in his expression. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something darker. His eyes flicked over to the guy standing by my driver's side, and the other guy on the passenger side tensed up. Without warning, the guy on my side reached for the door handle and pulled it open. "Get out," he ordered. His voice was low, hard, like he had done this 1,000 times before. I didn't move. My brain was trying to process what was happening, but it was all too fast. They couldn't be serious, could they? But the way they were acting, the way they were closing in, told me everything I needed to know. They weren't here to buy anything. They were here to take it. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out something metallic. My brain didn't immediately register it, but it was a gun. He pointed it at me, the barrel trembling slightly, but the intent behind it was clear. "You're not getting out of this car," he said, his voice flat. "You're gonna give us everything." My pulse was pounding in my ears. My mind was racing, trying to think of something, anything to do. But I was stuck. I couldn't run. I couldn't fight them off. I was trapped, alone in a parking lot, with 3 guys who were clearly ready to hurt me if I didn't comply. The guy on the passenger side grabbed the camera bag from the seat next to me, tugging it hard until it came free. "What else you got?" he demanded, shoving the bag in my face. I could hear my breath catch in my chest. "I don't have anything else." "That's it, just the camera." Jake scoffed, not believing me. He leaned in closer, his breath hot on my face. "I'm not asking again. You got cash? Your phone? Anything else you're hiding?" I could feel my hands start to shake, but I didn't want to give them anything. I didn't want to lose everything I had on me, but I knew better than to fight back. These guys weren't playing. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't here for a deal. They were here to rob me, and they were getting desperate. The guy on the passenger side grabbed my phone from the seat next to me without even asking, tossing it into the back seat with the rest of my stuff. I was too stunned to do anything. My stomach felt like it was turning over in knots. Jake's hand tightened on the gun. "Everything," he said again, more insistently this time. "Give us the keys. You're gonna get out of the car." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't have any keys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That was a lie. I still had the car keys in my pocket, but I wasn't about to hand them over. I couldn't. If I did, I was as good as gone. Jake's eyes flicked to my pocket, and I saw the shift in his expression. The realization that I wasn't giving him everything he wanted. Without warning, he shoved the gun into my face, pressing the cold barrel against my cheek. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said through gritted teeth. My chest was tight, my hands sweating. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to get out of this. I was paralyzed with fear, but my mind was also working overtime. I could hear the sound of cars passing by in the distance, but the parking lot was empty. No one was around. I felt the car doors unlock. The guy on the passenger side had opened the door, and they were getting ready to drag me out. I had no time to waste. There was only one thing I could think of doing. I grabbed the steering wheel, yanked it hard, and slammed the car into reverse. The impact knocked the guy standing behind me off balance, and I heard him shout as I hit the gas. The car jerked back, scraping the side of the car next to me. In the chaos, Jake fired a shot, but I didn't stop. I floored it, tearing out of the parking lot and speeding down the street without a second thought. I didn't care where I was going, I just had to get away. I didn't stop until I saw a well-lit gas station. I pulled into the lot and jumped out of the car, running toward the door, my heart still racing. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I didn't see them chasing me. I didn't even hear the sound of their car, but I wasn't taking any chances. I ran inside, told the cashier what had happened, and called the police. When they arrived, they took my statement, and I gave them everything I could remember about the guys, what they looked like, what their car looked like. But nothing came of it. They couldn't find them. No arrests were made. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. I don't know if they were just after the camera or if they had other plans. But I can tell you one thing, I'm never making that mistake again. It only takes one moment of trust to change everything. And when I let my guard down, everything almost came crashing down with it. I don't know how to explain it, but I think about that weekend all the time now. Every time I get an itch to go camping or rent a cabin, the memory hits me. It wasn't that I felt something was wrong at the time, it was subtle. But it didn't let go. Not then, and definitely not now. We were a group of 6 friends, close friends, the kind you've known forever. We decided to rent this cabin out in the woods for a long weekend. Nothing too fancy, just a small, rustic place tucked away near a national park. The kind of spot where you can disconnect, hike, and just enjoy each other's company. It was supposed to be peaceful, fun, just a break from our busy lives. The drive was long, and by the time we arrived, the sun was already starting to set. The cabin itself was a bit older than we expected, but it looked cozy enough. A wooden structure with a few creaky steps leading up to the front door. The kind of place where you could imagine spending the evening with a warm drink and good conversation. We unloaded our bags, set up some things, and then decided to explore the area a little before it got too dark. The first odd thing happened that evening. We were standing outside, just taking in the quiet. The air smelled like fresh pine in the earth, the kind of air that makes you feel more alive somehow. As we chatted about nothing in particular, one of my friends, Liz, pointed out that there were cigarette butts scattered near the back door. They weren't old either. They looked fresh. I remember she said, "Who's been smoking out here?" We all stopped for a moment, eyes scanning the ground. None of us smoked. At least, none of us did anymore. Not since high school. It was strange to see those cigarette butts, crisp and new, lying there on the dirt. We weren't near any main roads either, just a dirt path and trees surrounding us in every direction. Probably just someone passing through, Matt suggested, trying to brush it off. But it didn't sit right with me. I looked around. The back porch had a small set of stairs leading to the yard, which was completely dark. The trees were so thick back there that it felt like the woods went on forever. There was no sign of anyone, though. The place was secluded, isolated, even, and I couldn't imagine why anyone would come that close just to smoke a cigarette and leave. We figured it was nothing, just someone before us maybe, and decided to get some dinner and not let it spoil the mood. We didn't mention it much after that. The first night passed without incident. We stayed inside, ate, drank, and talked. We played cards, laughed, and stayed up late like we always did. The kind of carefree night that makes you feel like nothing bad could ever happen. But the next morning was when things started to feel off. I woke up to the sound of Liz asking from the other room, "Did anyone go outside last night?" We all looked at each other, groggy and confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. I swear I heard footsteps outside my window, like someone walking around the cabin. Did anyone get up to grab something or go outside? We all shook our heads. No one had gotten up, at least not that we knew of. But it was strange, none of us had heard the footsteps. Liz was spooked, but we all laughed it off, blaming it on the wind or some animal. I wanted to tell myself the same thing, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. We went about our day, hiking through the woods and enjoying the fresh air. But as we came back in the evening, there was something else that made my stomach twist. There were more cigarette butts. Not just near the back door this time, but also along the side of the cabin. Fresh ones. It had to be the same brand, two long, slender butts with the same burnt filter, still wet at the end. And again, none of us smoked. "Okay, this is weird," said Matt, his usual laid-back attitude now replaced with a tinge of frustration. "Who's messing with us?" We went outside to take a closer look. I felt my skin crawl when I saw the butts were scattered in a clear trail, leading off toward the edge of the woods. It didn't make sense. Who would be out here smoking, and why would they be leaving their trash behind like that? We stood there for a minute, unsure of what to do. Our laughter had faded, and there was this unspoken sense of discomfort creeping in. None of us wanted to admit it, but the thought of someone else being out there, so close to our cabin, made us uneasy. We stayed inside that night, locked up tight, making sure every window and door was secured. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept imagining someone watching us from the trees, hidden just beyond the reach of our lights. The next morning, things only got worse. I woke up earlier than usual, feeling like I hadn't slept at all. I went downstairs to make some coffee and looked out the window. What I saw made my heart stop. There, in the yard, were more cigarette butts. But this time, they weren't scattered around. They were arranged in a perfect circle, like someone had placed them there intentionally. A twisted, strange pattern in the grass, like a ritual or something. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Liz came in, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked when she saw me staring out the window. I didn't answer her right away. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know what to say. All I could think about was the fact that someone had been here. Someone had been watching us all along. We weren't alone. Liz saw it too. She gasped. "What is that? Did someone do that last night?" "I don't know," I whispered. "But we need to leave. Now." The panic was rising in my chest. I didn't want to wait around to find out who was out there or why they were doing this. We decided then and there to pack up and leave. No more waiting around. I didn't care if we lost the rental fee or if it ruined the weekend. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. As we packed up the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to step out of the woods or from behind a tree. But there was no one. The woods were eerily quiet, almost too quiet. The cigarette butts were still there, staring back at us, but they didn't seem to matter anymore. We left in a hurry, barely looking back. The drive back was silent. None of us said much, but we all knew. The tension was palpable. None of us had been comfortable since the first night, and I don't think any of us would ever feel the same about that cabin. I still don't know who left those cigarette butts, or why they were doing it. Maybe it was just someone messing with us, or maybe it was something worse. All I know is, I've never been back to that cabin. And I never will. Something about it felt wrong. Something about it still haunts me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still picture the butts scattered on the ground, like a sign. A warning. And I can't shake the feeling that someone who wasn't part of our group was there the whole time, watching us from the shadows. It started as a normal day, just another afternoon spent at the park with my son. It was one of those rare sunny days where the weather was perfect, and the playground was bustling with kids laughing and playing, parents chatting nearby, the usual hum of the neighborhood. I'd brought my son to the swings, letting him play while I sat on the nearby bench, keeping an eye on him like any parent would. He was busy laughing and pumping his legs higher and higher, his little face full of joy. I had been watching him for a few minutes when I noticed a man standing just off to the side, near the edge of the playground. He was just standing there, his hands in his pockets, not moving much. He wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, but something about him stood out. His posture, the way he was watching the children, he didn't seem like he was there just to enjoy the park. He looked uncomfortable. Not in a way that would immediately raise alarms, but in a way that didn't sit right with me. He wasn't really talking to anyone or doing anything. He was just standing there, eyes constantly scanning over the playground. At first, I tried to shake it off. I was probably overthinking it. You see people standing around all the time at parks. Maybe he was waiting for someone. I glanced around at the other parents, but none of them seemed to notice him. Everyone else seemed too wrapped up in their conversations or their own children to give him a second thought. But the longer I watched him, the more uneasy I became. He never moved from that spot. And every now and then, his eyes would linger just a little too long on the children playing nearby. It wasn't like he was interacting with them directly, but the way he stared at them made me uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I told myself to just focus on my son and ignore the man. But then I saw him glance over at me. It was quick, but our eyes met, and he immediately looked away. That was the moment that made me decide I couldn't just sit there anymore. I stood up, casually walking over to the swings where my son was still happily playing. As I got closer, I saw the man's posture shift. He didn't look like he was just waiting for a friend's child anymore. He looked almost nervous. His eyes flicked back to the playground, scanning the area once more. I don't know what made me do it, but I walked over to him. I felt like I had to say something. It didn't seem right to let him just stand there, watching everyone without explanation. "Hey," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Are you looking for someone?" He didn't seem startled, just turned slightly toward me, still standing with his hands in his pockets. He had an odd look on his face, like he was caught off guard but wasn't sure how to react. Yeah, he replied after a moment. "I'm waiting for a friend's kid." I raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" He hesitated, and for a brief second, I thought he was going to backpedal. Then he said, "Oh, it's that one." He pointed vaguely toward a group of children who were playing near the jungle gym. But the thing was, I knew all the kids in that area, either by name or by sight. They were all familiar faces from the neighborhood. And none of them seemed to have an unfamiliar adult standing near them. I gave him a skeptical look. "Which one exactly?" I asked again, this time more insistently. He looked uncomfortable but still kept his calm demeanor. You know, the one in the red jacket. I'm just waiting for her." I turned my attention to the kids nearby. None of them wore a red jacket, and none of them were being watched by an unfamiliar man. I looked back at him, and that was when the sinking feeling in my stomach grew deeper. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like he was lying. Or at least, he wasn't being totally upfront. "You're waiting for a child you don't know?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Is this a friend's child?" He gave a small, awkward chuckle, almost as if I'd said something funny. Yeah. Just a friend's kid," he replied again, a little too quickly. Now, something felt wrong. It didn't add up. If he was a parent or a relative, he should have known which kid he was waiting for. He should have had a reason to be there, something more concrete than a vague claim of waiting for someone's child. I had lived in this neighborhood for a while, and everyone knew each other. I should have recognized him if he was a parent or a regular at the park. But I didn't. I glanced around again. None of the other parents seemed to be paying attention to us, and my son was still on the swings, happily going back and forth. "I've never seen you around here before," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You sure you're in the right place?" He looked me dead in the eyes then. His expression didn't change, but for a moment I saw something in his face, something flickered, just beneath the surface. He wasn't just waiting for a child anymore. He was aware of my suspicion. He knew I wasn't buying it. "I'm just waiting for someone," he said again, but his voice had changed. It wasn't as calm now. There was a slight edge to it. "I'm sure you've got kids to watch, right?" I took a step back. My instincts told me to leave it alone, to just walk away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked at him one more time, and then I did something I should have done from the start. I called over to a friend who was standing nearby, one of the other parents who always came to the park with me. "Hey, do you recognize this guy?" I asked, loud enough so he could hear me. The man's face immediately tightened, his eyes shifting nervously from me to my friend. But my friend looked confused, too. "Nope, never seen him before," she said. That was when the man took a step back, glanced toward the exit of the park, and muttered something under his breath. "I guess I'm at the wrong park," he said, his voice suddenly soft and unconvincing. Without another word, he turned and walked briskly out of the park, keeping his head low. I watched him leave, heart pounding in my chest. My friend and I exchanged uneasy glances, both of us too quiet to speak. I'm not sure why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whole situation felt off. I know it might sound paranoid, but I've never been the type of person to second-guess my gut feeling, especially when it comes to something involving my kid. I told my son it was time to go, and we packed up quickly, walking to the car with a strange sense of urgency. As we left, I glanced back at the park and saw him again, just standing at the edge of the lot, watching us. His figure faded as I drove away, but the feeling stayed with me. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm sure of one thing: he wasn't just there to wait for a child. And I will never ignore my instincts again. I thought it was just another job opportunity, the kind of thing I needed after being out of work for a few months. I'd been scrolling through job postings every morning for weeks, trying to find something that paid well enough, something that didn't feel like it was just wasting my time. Then, last Tuesday, I saw it. The email popped up in my inbox, a job interview invitation for a position I thought was perfect for me, office administrator for a small company that sounded very promising. The email was clean, professional, and the company seemed to have solid reviews. I wasn't suspicious at all. The interview was set for 2 p.m. that day. The building was only a short drive from my apartment, so I planned to leave a little early. I didn't want to risk being late, especially for a job like this. I dressed in my usual business attire, trying to look as professional as possible, and left the house with plenty of time to spare. I arrived at the office building at about 1:45 p.m. It wasn't a huge skyscraper or anything, but it was a decent-sized building, a little older but well-maintained. The front door was locked, but I figured that was normal since it wasn't quite the top of the hour yet. I stood there, waiting for a minute, when a man walked up to the door, pushing it open with a key. He didn't seem to notice me standing there until the door was open. "Oh, you must be the candidate for the interview," he said, his voice warm and inviting. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in a clean white shirt and dark trousers, wearing glasses. He had a friendly smile. I nodded, smiling back. "Yes, that's me." He stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. "Please, come right in," he said. I followed him into the building, the door clicking shut behind me. The entrance area was quiet, with white walls and a small reception desk that was empty. There wasn't anyone sitting at the desk, and the hallway seemed to stretch off into the distance. The man led me down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the walls. "Do you want to tell me a little about your experience before we get started?" he asked, turning his head slightly to look at me. I nodded and began telling him about my previous roles, the work I'd done in various office settings. I was trying to keep calm and professional, but I couldn't help noticing how eerily quiet the building was. There were no other voices, no sounds of phones ringing or people typing away on keyboards. As we walked down the hallway, I began to realize that the office space was much smaller than I expected. There were only a few doors along the hallway, none of them had names or titles on them. I thought it was strange that the company had such a small space, especially considering the job descriptions seemed to imply they were more established. But maybe I was overthinking it. The man led me to a small office at the end of the hallway. He opened the door and gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs. "Please, make yourself comfortable," he said. The office was simple, with a desk and a few chairs scattered around. The blinds were drawn on the windows, leaving the room dim. I could only see a faint strip of light coming through the edges of the blinds. The whole place had a kind of sterile feeling to it, and I started to feel an odd unease in the pit of my stomach. I sat down as he closed the door behind him. He went around the desk and sat in the chair opposite me, pulling out a file folder from the desk drawer. He didn't immediately say anything, just started flipping through the papers inside. I cleared my throat and tried to break the silence. "So, what is the next step in the interview process?" He looked up at me with that same warm smile. "We'll just have a quick conversation," he said. "I just want to get a sense of who you are, your background, and how you fit into the position. There's not much to it, really." I nodded, trying to ignore the discomfort creeping up my spine. As he started asking me more questions, I began to notice that his focus seemed oddly intense. It wasn't just about my experience anymore. It was as if he was digging deeper into my personal life, asking about my family, my daily routines, my hobbies. At first, I thought it was just a natural part of getting to know someone during an interview, but then it started to feel invasive. I tried to keep my answers brief, but the questions kept coming. "So, what's your living situation like?" he asked, leaning slightly forward. "Are you living alone? Are you planning to relocate anytime soon?" I paused for a moment, feeling a twinge of unease. "I'm living alone for now," I said cautiously, not sure where he was going with this. "But no plans to relocate." He nodded, scribbling something down in the folder. "And what time do you usually go to bed? Do you have any late-night commitments?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure why, but this line of questioning felt strange. It wasn't the sort of thing I'd expect an interviewer to ask. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was part of some psychological test or something. "I usually go to bed around 11, I said, not wanting to dwell on the weirdness of it all. He smiled again, but there was something different about it this time. His eyes didn't look warm anymore. They looked more like he was calculating something. "Good," he said, still scribbling in the folder. "Now, I'm just going to lock the door behind us. I'll be right back." I watched as he stood up and walked over to the door. I assumed he was just stepping out for a moment, maybe to grab a drink or speak to someone outside. But instead of opening the door, I saw him turn the lock, and the sharp click of the door locking echoed through the room. I froze, unsure of what to do. My pulse quickened. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice tight with sudden anxiety. The man turned slowly, still smiling, but this time there was something unsettling about the smile. "I just don't want to be disturbed," he said, his tone too calm, too casual. "It's important that we finish this interview without interruptions." I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. "I think I need to leave," I said, trying to stay composed, but my voice shook. He didn't respond immediately, just walked back toward the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. I could feel my anxiety rising with every passing second. Something was wrong. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was something else entirely. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I tried again, panicking now, but the door was firmly locked. The man walked toward me, still smiling. "Don't worry," he said, his voice too calm, too reassuring. "We're just getting started." That's when I realized I had made a huge mistake by coming here. I didn't know what he wanted, but I was certain I wasn't safe anymore. I looked around the room, my mind racing for a way out. There had to be a way out. This happened last year, and it's still hard to shake off. I've never really told anyone about it, but now, I feel like it's finally time to share. It all started one afternoon when I came home from work. I had a long day, nothing unusual, just the usual rush hour traffic and the stress of dealing with clients. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a package sitting by my front door. It was just a regular brown box, nothing special. I figured it was something I had ordered online. I couldn't remember what it was, but I was always getting small deliveries for different things, so it wasn't that odd. I didn't think twice about it. I grabbed the box and brought it inside. It was heavier than I expected, but I thought it might just be a few books or something. I set it down on the kitchen counter and looked at the label. It was addressed to someone I didn't know. The name was completely unfamiliar, and the return address didn't ring any bells either. I was confused, but I figured it was just a mistake from a delivery service. I figured I'd call them, explain the mix-up, and get it sorted. But something made me hesitate. I don't know why. Maybe it was because it was already in my house, or maybe I was just curious about what was inside. I tore off the tape, opened the box, and stared at what was inside. It wasn't what I expected at all. There was a large plastic bag filled with something wrapped in cloth. At first, I thought it was just a bunch of clothes, maybe some sort of donation item. But then I saw what was underneath the fabric. There were photographs. Old, faded ones, stacked on top of each other. Some of them were of people I didn't recognize, but others were of me. They were pictures taken from the street outside my house, from angles I knew were impossible unless someone had been watching me for a while. I could feel my heart start to race as I flipped through more of the pictures. There were shots of me walking my dog, getting into my car, even standing at my kitchen window. It was like someone had been following me for months. But that wasn't the worst part. Beneath the photos, there was something wrapped in more cloth. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully unwrapped it. It was a lock of hair. Long, dark hair. The kind that matched mine. My stomach twisted as I stared at it. It felt like the air had gotten heavy, suffocating. It didn't make sense. Why would someone send this to me? I set the box down, shaking, trying to figure out what to do. I was about to call the police when I heard a knock at the door. I froze. I didn't know what to think. Who would knock at this time of day, especially after I'd just opened that box? I stood still for a second, wondering if maybe I was just being paranoid, but then I heard the knock again. More urgent this time. It wasn't a gentle knock, it was forceful, almost angry. I walked cautiously to the door, trying to calm my breathing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Through the peephole, I saw a man standing there. He looked normal enough, mid-40s, average build, dressed in a worn-out jacket and jeans. But his expression, his eyes were wide, frantic, like he was on the edge of something. He knocked again, louder this time. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. Something about this didn't sit right. I didn't open the door right away. Instead, I stepped back, trying to stay calm. I was about to call the police when I heard the man speak through the door. "I know you have it," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need it back." I didn't respond. My mind was racing. What the hell was he talking about? What did he want from me? "I saw you open it," he said, his voice trembling with panic now. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." I couldn't breathe. I knew it wasn't a coincidence that the package had come to my door. This man had sent it, and whatever was inside, whatever was happening, it was more than just a strange mistake. "I'm not going to ask again," he said. "Give it back. Now." I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed with fear. My hands were shaking, and my mind was trying to think to make sense of the situation. But there was no way I was going to let this man in, not after what I'd just seen. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I knew I needed to call the police, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the door. The man was still standing there, his silhouette barely visible through the glass. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I knew he was still there. I called 911. My voice was shaky, and I couldn't get the words out fast enough. I told the dispatcher everything: the package, the photos, the hair, and the man at the door. They assured me help was on the way, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before I heard the sirens. The man was still there when the police arrived, standing just outside my door, pacing. The officers asked me to stay back, and they quickly got the situation under control. The man didn't try to run. He just stood there, almost like he was waiting to be arrested. They took him into custody, but I didn't hear much about what happened after that. The police didn't give me many details. They took the box, the photos, and everything else, and said they would handle it. They assured me I was safe, but I didn't feel safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me for so long, and the idea that he knew so much about me was horrifying. I never found out who the man was or why he'd sent the package. The police said it was part of an ongoing investigation, but I don't think I'll ever know the full truth. I've never had a delivery mistake like that again, but I'm always looking over my shoulder now. I never open a package without checking who it's for. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear a noise outside my window. I always wonder if it's him. I don't even know where to begin. I've been trying to tell myself it was nothing, just some weird misunderstanding, but I can't shake it. Not after what happened. It started out so normal. We were camping, just the two of us, my girlfriend, Emma, and me. We had picked out a spot deep in the woods, far away from the crowds. We wanted peace, quiet, and the chance to disconnect from everything for a few days. The first day went well. We set up our tent by a small creek, started a fire, and just relaxed. It was a beautiful spot, nothing out of the ordinary. No strange feelings, no weird vibes. Just the two of us talking and laughing, enjoying the evening. It wasn't until the second night that things got strange. It started with them. A group of campers. We hadn't seen them before, but around dusk, they appeared by the fire. They seemed friendly enough, two guys and a woman walking along the trail not far from our site. At first, we barely noticed them, but one of them called out, asking if we wanted to join them for a drink. We had nothing planned for the evening, so we figured, why not? We walked over to their camp, and they were sitting around a fire, the flames casting long shadows in the trees. They had a couple of beers, a bottle of whiskey, and a few snacks. It seemed normal enough. We introduced ourselves, and they were nice. Not overly friendly, but polite. We all started talking, mostly about where we were from and how we ended up here. I'll admit, the conversation was a little awkward at first, but after a few drinks, it loosened up. It was just casual chatter at first, nothing strange. They told us they had been camping in the area for a while, moving from place to place, exploring different parts of the woods. They said they liked the solitude, and I could see that. It wasn't a surprise that they'd come up here to get away from it all. The woman, her name was Claire, was nice enough. But there was something about her smile that felt a little too sharp, a little too knowing. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was nothing, but I kept getting this feeling that she was watching me just a bit too closely. Every time I glance over at her, she'd be looking right at me, and when our eyes met, she'd smile. It didn't feel threatening, not exactly, but there was something unsettling about it. As the night wore on, the mood seemed to shift. It wasn't overt, but it was there. The guys started making more jokes, laughing a bit too loud, and Claire seemed to get quieter, just watching. I remember trying to keep the conversation going, but it felt like I was the only one still trying. Emma had already finished her drink and looked a little tired, like she was ready to head back to our camp. I felt the same, honestly. The night had stretched on longer than we planned. So, we told them we were going to head back. That's when things started to get weird. At first, it was subtle. One of the guys, Dave, I think his name was, stood up and clapped me on the shoulder, laughing. "You guys aren't going anywhere," he said, too loudly. "The night's still young. Come on, stay for a bit." I chuckled awkwardly, not really feeling like staying. "We're pretty tired," I said, trying to keep it light. "Maybe another time." But then Claire spoke. "You don't want to go yet," she said, and her voice had changed. It wasn't threatening, but it had a kind of cold edge to it, like she wasn't asking anymore. "The night's beautiful. You won't find peace like this anywhere else. Just stay a little longer." I felt this sudden pressure, like they were all looking at us, waiting for an answer. Emma looked at me, and I could tell she was uncomfortable too, but she didn't want to make a scene. She nodded, giving a forced smile. "Maybe just a little longer," she said. I wasn't sure why, but something about it didn't sit right. The way they were staring at us made me feel like we didn't really have a choice. I tried to shake it off, but I could feel the tension building. It was like they were waiting for us to stay, to make us stay. I didn't want to be rude, but I knew we needed to get back. Emma had already started to gather her things. I stood up, ready to go, but Dave was standing just a little too close, blocking the path. "You don't need to go," he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost too calm. "We've got a few more drinks. Just relax." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was something in his eyes, something that wasn't right. I tried to step around him, but he didn't move. It was like he was deliberately keeping me there, like they were all trying to keep us from leaving. "We really have to go," I said, my voice a little more firm now. "We've got stuff to do tomorrow." Claire stood up and took a step closer. "You'll be fine," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "It's not safe to walk back through the woods at night. Stay here. We'll keep you safe." It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way she said it, like there was no other option. I felt trapped, like if I didn't go along with it, something worse might happen. I tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder to hide how uneasy I felt. I looked over at Emma, who seemed equally uncomfortable but didn't say anything. I could see her trying to make up her mind, her eyes darting around the camp, looking for an excuse, an out. "Look, we really appreciate it," Emma said, standing up and reaching for my hand. "But we're just going to go back. It's getting late." There was a long pause. I could feel their eyes on us, like they were waiting for us to say the right thing. Then, suddenly, Dave stepped aside, giving us just enough space to walk by. But as I passed him, he grabbed my arm, just a quick grip, tight enough to make me stop in my tracks. "You know," he said, his voice low, "if you really wanted to go, you wouldn't have said that. You'd be gone already." It was like a switch flipped. I didn't think. I just yanked my arm away and pulled Emma with me. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaky but firm. We didn't look back as we hurried down the trail, the light of their campfire flickering behind us, but I could feel them watching us. We didn't say anything to each other until we were safely back at our tent. We just sat there, breathing hard, staring at the darkness outside, not knowing if they were still out there. I still don't know what exactly happened, but I know that they didn't want us to leave. There was something about that whole interaction that felt wrong, like they were pushing us to stay for some reason. I haven't camped since then, and I don't know if I ever will again. I don't think I could handle it. Every time I close my eyes, I remember the way they looked at us, those smiles that never reached their eyes, and I can't shake the feeling that they weren't just trying to be friendly. They were trying to keep us there, and for what? I don't think I'll ever know. I went out camping by myself for the first time in a long time. I usually went with a group, but I had been feeling kind of drained from everything and thought some quiet time would help. It was a spot I'd been to before, not far from a trailhead. It wasn't an official campground, but it was a clear area near a creek tucked into the woods. I set up my tent, had a quick meal, and just sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The weather was good, cool, no rain, and the stars were out. I turned in early, around 9 or so. I was tired from hiking in and setting up camp, and honestly, I was looking forward to a good night's sleep. I had packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, and a few supplies. I kept my food in a bag tied up in a tree, about 20 feet from the campsite, like I'd always been told to do. You don't want animals getting into it. I woke up later, and at first, I wasn't sure why. My eyes opened in the dark, and I just lay there, trying to figure out what had woken me up. Then I heard a low, crunching sound, like something heavy stepping on twigs and leaves. It was close. My tent was small, with only a thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was out there, and I could hear every little sound. The crunching stopped for a moment, and I held my breath. Then I heard another noise, a deep, wet snuffling sound. It was loud, and it sent a cold shock through me. I knew right away what it was. A bear. There was no mistaking it. My heart started pounding. I lay as still as I could, staring up at the roof of the tent, listening. The bear moved closer, and I heard the sound of my food bag being torn at. The rope I'd used to hang it up must not have been high enough. I felt stupid for not checking it better, but now it didn't matter. All I could think was that it was right there, and if it wanted to, it could easily come toward the tent next. The sound of the bear tearing into the bag went on for what felt like forever. It huffed and grunted, and every so often, there was a loud crunch as it bit into something. I was too scared to move, even though I knew I should try to make noise or do something to scare it off. But what if that just made it mad? I didn't have anything to protect myself, no gun or bear spray, just a small camping knife that was still in my backpack. Even if I had it in my hand, I knew it wouldn't do much. I thought about trying to reach for my phone to check the time, but it was in the corner of the tent, and I didn't dare move. I didn't even want to unzip the sleeping bag. I just stayed frozen, listening. My whole body felt tense, like my muscles were locked up, and every little sound the bear made seemed to echo inside my head. At one point, I heard it moving again. The heavy steps came closer, slow and deliberate. I could feel the vibrations in the ground, just faint but there. It was coming toward the tent. My chest felt tight, and I thought I might stop breathing altogether. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that would somehow help. The bear sniffed loudly, right next to the tent. I could hear it so clearly that I felt like I could picture it in my head, its nose brushing against the fabric, the sound of its breath, low and rumbling. My mind kept racing, imagining what would happen if it decided to push through. I could feel tears starting to well up, but I didn't move. I just kept telling myself to stay still, to stay quiet, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. The bear circled the tent, slow and steady. I could hear its claws scraping the ground as it moved, and every step felt like it lasted an eternity. At one point, it stopped, and I thought maybe it had gone back to the food. But then I heard it again, closer this time, its breath heavy and loud. I couldn't tell how long it stayed near the tent. Time felt stretched out and strange, like hours were passing even though it might have only been minutes. Finally, the bear let out a low grunt and moved away. I could hear it walking back toward where the food bag had been, the steps growing fainter. I didn't move. I stayed curled up in the sleeping bag, my fists clenched so tight that my hands were sore. I was too scared to do anything, too scared to even think clearly. The noises from the bear went on for a while longer, but they were farther away now. Eventually, they stopped altogether. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just lay there, every little creak or rustle making my heart race all over again. When the first light started to come through the tent, I finally dared to unzip it and look outside. The food bag was gone, completely torn off the rope and dragged away somewhere. There were deep claw marks in the dirt and mud near the tree, and even some on the tree trunk itself. I packed up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole time, and I kept looking around, expecting to see the bear coming back. By the time I was on the trail heading back to my car, the sun was fully up, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little noise in the woods made me jump. When I finally got back to my car and locked the doors, I felt like I could breathe again. I sat there for a long time before I started the engine, just trying to calm down. Even now, thinking about it makes my stomach twist. It's not like I was attacked or anything, but being that close to something so powerful and knowing there's nothing you can do, it stays with you. It makes you feel small. It was late, and the rain hadn't stopped all day. I was at the library trying to finish an essay that was already overdue, my laptop battery at 3%, and I still had no idea how to end the last paragraph. The lights flickered once, and I knew I couldn't push it any longer. When I packed up my things, the library was nearly empty. The rain outside had gotten heavier, the kind that turned streets into rivers. I sighed, looking at the umbrellas in the stand near the door. Mine was gone, someone must have taken it by mistake, but I wasn't going to walk home in this weather without one. I grabbed a plain black umbrella that looked just like mine and stepped outside. The walk to my apartment wasn't far, just 10 minutes if I cut through the small park on the edge of campus. The rain made the whole world quieter. There was nothing but the sound of water hitting the pavement and the occasional car hissing by. The streets were empty, and most of the streetlights were reflected in puddles. I kept my head down and tried not to think about how cold it was. I noticed a man when I turned onto the path through the park. He was standing by one of the benches, his head tilted up, like he was looking at the rain. He had no umbrella or hood, just a dark jacket that clung to his shoulders. At first, I thought he was just someone who liked the rain, maybe taking a break from wherever he was going. But as I passed him, he turned and started walking in the same direction. I didn't think much of it. It was a public path, after all, and it wasn't unusual to see other students cutting through here. Still, something about the way his footsteps matched mine made me uneasy. I glanced back, and he was closer than I thought, his face hard to make out in the dim light. "Hey," he called, his voice sharp and clear over the rain. "That's my umbrella." I stopped, gripping the handle tighter. "What?" He took a few steps closer, his face coming into the light. He was older than me, maybe mid-30s, with wet hair plastered to his forehead and dark eyes that didn't seem to blink. "You took my umbrella," he said, his tone flat. I looked at the umbrella in my hand. It was just a plain black one, nothing special. "This was in the stand," I said. "I thought it was mine." "If it's yours, I'm sorry. Here." I held it out to him, but he didn't take it. Instead, he just stared at me, water dripping from his face. "You took it," he repeated, like I hadn't just offered it back. I felt my stomach tighten. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about the umbrella. "Look, I'm sorry," I said again, a little more firmly. "Take it." He still didn't move. I didn't know what else to do, so I set the umbrella on the ground and started walking again. The rain was colder now, soaking through my clothes, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. His footsteps started again behind me. "Hey," he called again, louder this time. "Wait." I ignored him, picking up my pace. My apartment building wasn't far now, just at the edge of the park. I could see the lights in the windows, warm and inviting. I was almost there when I heard his footsteps break into a run. Panic hit me like a wave, and I started running too, the water splashing around my ankles. My bag banged against my hip, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear him getting closer, his breaths loud and uneven. I reached the door of my building and fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. I glanced over my shoulder, and he was there, just a few feet away, his face pale and twisted with something I couldn't name. "Give it back," he shouted, his voice raw. "I left it on the path." I shouted back, my voice breaking. "It's right there." He didn't seem to hear me. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm. His grip was like iron, his fingers digging into my skin. I screamed, twisting away, and the movement sent me crashing into the door. My keys slipped from my fingers and fell into the puddle at my feet. "Let go!" I yelled, my voice cracking. He didn't say anything this time, just pulled harder, dragging me away from the door. His strength was terrifying. I kicked out, my foot connecting with his shin, and he stumbled just enough for me to wrench free. I grabbed my keys and jammed them into the lock, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door. The small window at the top was fogged with rain, but I could see him standing there, his hands pressed against the glass, his face twisted in anger. "You took it," he said again, his voice muffled but still clear. "You don't get to keep it." I didn't know what he meant. It was just an umbrella. A stupid, cheap umbrella. He stayed there for a long moment, his hands sliding down the glass, leaving streaks of water. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I didn't sleep that night. I kept expecting to hear him pounding on the door or see his face at the window. The next morning, when the rain finally stopped, I went back to the park. The umbrella was gone. I thought it would be a quiet weekend away from everything. My partner and I had been planning the trip for weeks, just a simple camping trip in a state park we'd visited before. It wasn't peak season, so we expected it to be pretty empty. That was the appeal. We got there early Friday afternoon, picked a site close to the tree line, and set up our tent. The air was crisp, and the park was quiet. There were maybe 2 other cars in the lot, but we didn't see anyone else. It felt like we had the place to ourselves. By the time we'd started dinner over the fire, the sun was setting, and the woods around us grew darker. It was peaceful, just the sound of the fire crackling and the occasional rustle in the bushes. We were sitting there talking when we heard footsteps on the gravel path leading to our site. A man walked into the light of the fire. He was dressed in a ranger's uniform, green pants, brown shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat. He carried a clipboard in one hand. He looked official enough, but there was something off about him. His uniform was clean but didn't seem to fit him right, like it was too big in some places and too tight in others. His boots were scuffed, but not in a way that made sense for someone who'd been out in the woods all day. "Evening," he said, his voice calm and low. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" "Routine check." I glanced at my partner, who shrugged. It didn't seem out of the ordinary. Park rangers sometimes check permits or make sure you're following the rules. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. He asked where we were from, how long we planned to stay, and if we had the proper permits. We showed him the printed reservation confirmation, which he barely glanced at before nodding. Then he started asking about our gear, what kind of tent we had, how much food we brought, if we had a way to lock it up. That's when I started to feel uneasy. The questions didn't seem relevant, especially the ones about our supplies. It felt like he was sizing us up. He lingered, glancing at our tent, the cooler by the fire, and the car parked nearby. "You're pretty far back here," he said, almost like he was thinking out loud. "Not many people around this time of year." "We like the quiet," my partner said, trying to make light of it. The man nodded slowly, then made a mark on his clipboard. "Well, you folks enjoy your evening. Weather's supposed to be clear. Just remember, if you need anything, the ranger station is about a mile down the main trail." He didn't smile or say goodbye, just turned and walked back the way he came. We watched him disappear into the darkness, his footsteps fading until it was quiet again. Something about the encounter stuck with me. I told myself it was just the way he looked at our things, or maybe the way he phrased his questions. My partner brushed it off, saying he was probably just doing his job. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the tent made me sit up and listen, convinced I'd hear footsteps again. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, we decided to hike to the ranger station, partly to confirm what he'd said and partly to see if it would ease my mind. We followed the main trail, but when we got to the spot where the station should have been, there was nothing there. No building, no sign, nothing. I thought maybe we'd taken a wrong turn, but my partner pulled up the park map on their phone. We were in the right place. We decided to walk back to the car and check with the park office near the entrance. When we got there, I asked about the ranger who'd visited our site. The woman at the desk frowned. "There's no ranger on duty in that area this weekend," she said. I felt my stomach drop. "Are you sure?" He had a uniform, a clipboard. She shook her head. "We don't have anyone scheduled for that section. It's the off-season, so we're running a smaller staff." "Are you sure it was a ranger?" I didn't know how to respond. I described him, but she didn't seem to recognize the description. She said she'd make a note of it, but there wasn't much else she could do. We left the office and sat in the car for a while, trying to process what had happened. My partner suggested it could have been someone impersonating a ranger, but that only made it worse. Why would someone do that? We decided to pack up and leave. The thought of spending another night out there, knowing someone had been watching us, was too much. When we got back to the campsite, everything seemed normal at first. But as we started packing, I noticed something was missing: our food cooler. It had been sitting by the fire pit the night before, but now it was gone. The ground was wet from dew, and I could see faint footprints leading away from the site, into the woods. I didn't want to follow them. We packed up as quickly as we could and left. On the drive home, I kept replaying the encounter in my head. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but the way he looked at our things, the way he said we were far back and alone, it felt like a warning. I haven't been camping since. It's hard to know where to begin with this. I think it's taken me so long to write this because it still feels like a bad dream. Even now, when I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that something went horribly wrong that day, something that could have been avoided if we just made different choices. We were all experienced hikers, at least a little, and we planned this trip for months. The idea was to camp in the mountains for a weekend, just to disconnect from everything. It was supposed to be simple. We'd done this kind of thing before, just not in this particular area. The weather had been fine the whole trip, and the first couple of days went off without a hitch. We had our laughs, we cooked our meals over a fire, and everything felt normal, almost too normal. By the third day, we were packing up to head back. It was late afternoon, and we had been moving slowly through the trails, not wanting to rush. But when we reached a certain point, one of the guys, Mark, suggested taking a shortcut. He'd been to this area a few times before, and apparently, this canyon was a faster way back to our camp. We all thought it was a good idea. We had a little time to spare, and the weather was holding up. It seemed like a quick detour that would save us some hours. None of us thought twice when Mark led the way. The canyon was narrow, with sheer rock walls on either side, but it didn't look dangerous. In fact, it looked beautiful in a way, like something out of a postcard. We walked through, chatting and laughing, taking in the view, oblivious to how quickly the time was slipping away. It wasn't until we'd gotten about halfway through that we noticed something wasn't right. At first, it was just a small sound, like gravel shifting behind us. Then it happened again. And again. It was almost like something was moving behind us, but when we turned around, there was nothing there. I remember feeling uneasy but brushing it off as nothing. Maybe just the rocks shifting, or the wind, who knows? But as we kept walking, the sound grew louder. It was like it was getting closer, and I could tell by the looks on everyone else's faces that they were starting to feel it too. But Mark, he didn't seem concerned. He kept saying it was nothing and urged us to keep going. We trusted him. That was our first mistake. I'm not sure what exactly happened after that. Maybe the sound was the beginning of it, or maybe it was just bad luck. But all of a sudden, the ground beneath us started to shake. It wasn't just a small tremor. The rocks above us began to shift, and before any of us could react, the entire side of the canyon gave way. I remember the sound first, the screech of stone scraping against stone, the crashing and rumbling as the rocks began to tumble down. And then the dust. It was like the world went gray all at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, and I remember feeling the ground jerk beneath me. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, trying to cover my face from the dirt and rocks. I could hear the others yelling, but everything was muffled. The chaos was overwhelming, like the world was collapsing in on itself. When the dust finally started to settle, I opened my eyes. The canyon walls had changed. What had once been a clear path was now a mess of rocks and debris, completely blocking our way. Mark was the closest to me, his face covered in dirt, but he was alive. I could see he was trying to stand, his legs shaky. We all helped each other up, but the reality of the situation hit hard. We were trapped. The narrow canyon we'd been walking through was now impassable, and there was no way to climb out. I remember looking up and realizing that the canyon walls were too steep, too smooth to climb. And no matter how many times we shouted, no one came. We were completely alone. There were no other hikers, No signs of life, just the sound of the wind and our panic breathing. I looked around at the others. We had a few supplies, water, some food, our basic camping gear, but nothing that could help us get out of there. The worst part was the silence. It felt like we were miles from help, and in that moment, it hit me that no one knew where we were. We hadn't checked in with anyone, and I wasn't sure anyone even knew which way we'd gone. We hadn't planned for something like this. The first few hours were spent trying to move the rocks, trying to dig our way out, but it was useless. Every time we thought we'd found a way through, more rocks would shift, making it harder to get through. We had enough water to last us a while, but that didn't make the fear go away. It was becoming clear that our time was running out. We couldn't stay here. We needed to get out. By nightfall, things got worse. It was already getting cold, and the air was thick with dust. We huddled together for warmth, but I could tell we were all exhausted. Mark was the one trying to keep everyone calm, but even he seemed rattled. No one said it out loud, but we all knew it. We were stuck. No one was coming to help, and the rocks above us could still fall. We rationed the food and water, but with the days dragging on, it didn't seem like it would be enough. The next morning, we made a decision. There wasn't much we could do at that point, but we had to try something. We needed to get to higher ground to see if we could find a way out. But even that felt like a stretch. As we moved toward the top of the canyon, trying to find a way through the rocks, one of the guys, Sam, tripped and twisted his ankle. It wasn't just a sprain. The way he screamed when he fell, I knew it was bad. We had to stop and tend to him, and that delayed us even further. But in the back of my mind, I knew that we were running out of time. The reality was starting to sink in. After a few days, when it seemed like we might not make it out, something changed. We had all been silently wondering if it was possible that we weren't alone in this canyon. The silence around us was so complete that it felt unnatural. And then, one afternoon, Mark disappeared. I don't know how he did it. I don't know if he was trying to find help, or if he'd just gone crazy, but he was gone. He'd left without a word. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of him. It felt like he just vanished. That's when I knew we weren't going to make it out without help. It was too dangerous to keep going alone. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I managed to climb up to the top of the canyon, to a small ledge where I could get a better view. From there, I could see the main trail that we had taken days earlier. I could see the small stream where we had camped, just a few miles away. I knew we had to make it. It wasn't much, but it was the only chance we had left. We made it back to camp just in time. It was a hard climb down, and Sam was still hurt, but we made it. I don't know how we survived that canyon, but we did. We were lucky, I guess. I still don't know what happened to Mark. It started late in the evening when I first noticed the figure outside. The rain had been pouring steadily for hours, tapping against the windows in a way that always made the house feel colder. I had been in the living room, half watching an old movie while scrolling through my phone, when something outside caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a trick of the rain, but then I saw it clearly, a person standing across the street, motionless. The yellow of their raincoat stood out sharply against the dark, wet night. They were facing the house across from mine, standing perfectly still, like they were waiting for something. Their head tilted slightly, like they were looking in the windows. I remember thinking it was strange, but not enough to do anything. People act oddly sometimes. Maybe they were waiting for someone or trying to get out of the rain for a moment. It wasn't until later that I realized I had been glancing at the clock more and more, checking to see if they'd left. They didn't. An hour passed. The figure didn't move. They stayed there, facing that house, their shoulders stiff, their hands at their sides. I turned off the movie and went to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek out. The street light above them flickered slightly, casting their shadow long across the pavement. The rain was heavy, but I could still see the edges of their hood and the way their head was angled toward the lit windows across the street. I told myself to stop staring. It wasn't my business. But when I looked again, they had shifted slightly. Not toward the house they'd been facing, but toward mine. That's when the uneasiness started. It wasn't much at first, just a heavy feeling in my chest like something wasn't right. I locked the front door. The thought made me feel silly, but I couldn't shake the way my fingers lingered on the deadbolt, pressing it firmly into place. By midnight, the rain had gotten worse. The water ran in streams along the curb, and the sound of it was loud enough to drown out everything else. I tried to ignore the figure outside, but every time I looked, they were still there. The way they just stood without moving made my stomach twist. I convinced myself they'd leave eventually. No one would just stand in the rain all night. But then they moved. It wasn't a lot, just a step or two, but it was enough to make me sit up straight. They were walking now, slowly, their boots splashing in the water as they crossed the street. I couldn't see their face, only the shadow of their hood, but I could feel their focus. It wasn't on the house across the street anymore. It was on mine. I didn't turn off the lights, even though I wanted to. Something about being in the dark felt worse, like I wouldn't see them coming. Instead, I stayed near the window, keeping the curtain pulled back just enough to watch. The yellow raincoat was bright even in the dim streetlight. They stopped halfway across the street and just stood there, the water pooling around their feet. The rain made it impossible to hear anything, but I swear I saw their shoulders rise and fall, like they were breathing deeply. Their head tilted again, this time toward my window. I ducked back, my heart hammering. For a while, I stayed out of sight, pacing the living room and checking the locks on every door. I told myself to call someone, anyone, but the idea of trying to explain what was happening felt ridiculous. What would I say? There's someone standing outside in a raincoat? They haven't done anything. They haven't said anything. They're just there. When I worked up the nerve to look again, they were closer. The raincoat was now at the edge of my driveway. The shadow of the hood hid their face completely, but they were angled toward the house, and I knew they were looking. My throat felt tight, my hands sweating as I gripped my phone. I couldn't take my eyes off them, afraid they'd move the second I blinked. Then they did. It was slow and deliberate. They walked up the driveway, each step heavy and sure. I backed away from the window, my stomach twisting into knots. Every instinct told me not to look, not to let them know I was watching, but I couldn't stop myself. I peeked out again and saw them standing at the edge of the porch, just feet from the door. The rain made it hard to see details, but there was something in their hand. It was long and dark, like a piece of metal. I stared at it, trying to figure out what it was, when they raised it and tapped it lightly against the door frame. The sound was muffled by the rain, but I felt it. A hollow, deliberate knock. I backed away slowly, clutching my phone. I dialed 911, my hands trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. The dispatcher's voice was calm, too calm, as I stammered out what was happening. She asked if the person had tried to break in or if they were threatening me. I told her no, but I didn't know what else to say. The tapping continued, steady and unhurried. I couldn't tell if they knew I was watching or if they were just waiting. The dispatcher promised to send someone, but I couldn't stop glancing at the front door, afraid that by the time help came, it would be too late. Then, the tapping stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The rain was still pounding, masking every other sound. When I looked out the window again, they were gone. The raincoat was nowhere in sight, and the driveway was empty. For a moment, I thought they'd left. But then I heard a soft creak, not from the front door, but from the side of the house. My blood ran cold as I realized they were moving around, looking for another way in. The sound of footsteps came from the back now, slow and deliberate. I locked myself in the bathroom, my phone pressed to my ear as I whispered to the dispatcher that they were still here. She told me to stay calm, that help was on the way, but her voice felt distant, like I was underwater. The footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door. I froze, the phone slipping from my hands. There was no knock this time, no tapping. Just silence, heavy and oppressive. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was sure they could hear it. I pressed myself against the far wall, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something to happen. Then, finally, I heard the sound of sirens. They started faint, growing louder as they approached. The footsteps retreated quickly, the sound fading into the rain. By the time the police arrived, the house was empty, and the figure in the yellow raincoat was gone. The officers searched the area, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. All that was left was a single muddy streak on the side of the house, right below the bathroom window. When I checked into the hotel, it was already late. I'd been driving all day, and all I wanted was to take a shower and sleep. The hotel wasn't anything fancy, just one of those chain places off the highway, but it looked clean enough from the outside. The woman at the front desk was polite. She handed me my key card, smiled, and told me my room was on the 3rd floor. The elevator creaked a bit on the way up, but I didn't think much of it. When I got to my room, I slid the key card in, and the little green light blinked. I pushed the door open, but it stopped short, like something was blocking it. At first, I thought maybe the door was sticking or the latch hadn't fully disengaged. I gave it another push, harder this time, and it opened enough for me to see inside. There was a man standing in the middle of the room. I froze. He didn't look surprised to see me, and that was the first thing that set me on edge. He just stood there, calm, like he'd been expecting me. He wasn't holding anything, wasn't doing anything threatening, but the way he stared, it was cold, detached. "This is my room," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice cracked a little. He didn't respond. Just stood there, watching me. I glanced down the hallway, half expecting someone to jump out and say this was some kind of prank, but it was empty. "Did they give you the wrong room too?" I asked, trying again, even though I already knew something wasn't right. The man tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my question. Then, finally, he spoke. "This room is occupied." I felt a chill run through me. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Slow, deliberate. Like he wasn't telling me, but warning me. "I just checked in," I said, stepping back into the hallway. There must be some kind of mistake. He didn't answer. I slowly closed the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then I turned and headed straight back to the elevator. When I got back to the front desk, the woman looked up, surprised to see me. I told her there was someone in my room. At first, she seemed confused, but then she frowned and started typing on her computer. "That's not possible," she said after a moment. "Room 314 hasn't been checked out to anyone." I stared at her, waiting for her to say something else, but she just looked back at me like she didn't believe me. "I'm telling you, there's a man in there," I said. "He said the room was occupied." She hesitated, then picked up the phone and called someone. I couldn't hear much of the conversation, but she kept glancing at me, her brow furrowed. When she hung up, she said she'd send someone up to check. She offered me a new room in the meantime, but I wasn't sure I even wanted to stay there anymore. A maintenance worker met me at the elevator a few minutes later. He had a key of his own and told me to stay in the hallway while he checked a room. I watched as he opened the door and stepped inside. He was in there for what felt like forever, and when he finally came back out, he looked at me, confused. "There's no one in there," he said. I didn't believe him. "I saw him," I insisted. He was standing right in the middle of the room. The worker just shrugged. Maybe he left before I got here. Door's clear now, though. I didn't want to go back in, but the thought of leaving without my things, my suitcase, my laptop, kept me rooted there. The worker handed me my key card and left, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The room was empty. Completely empty. No sign of a man, no sign anyone had been there. My suitcase was still where I'd left it by the door, untouched. The bed was made, the bathroom light was off, and nothing looked out of place. I locked the door behind me, double-checked it, and even dragged the desk chair in front of it, just in case. I didn't feel safe, but I didn't know what else to do. I tried to convince myself that maybe the worker was right, that the man had just slipped out while I was downstairs. But then I noticed something. The room smelled faintly of cigarettes. It was subtle, but definitely there. The hotel was non-smoking, and I hadn't smelled it when I first walked in. I checked the trash can, the bathroom, even under the bed, but there was nothing. No ashtray, no butt, nothing. I tried to shake it off and focus on getting ready for bed. I took the fastest shower of my life, keeping the bathroom door locked and the curtain half open so I could see out. When I finally crawled into bed, I left the lamp on, even though I knew it wouldn't really make a difference. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me jump, the hum of the air conditioner, the creak of the building settling, even my own breathing. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to a soft noise. It took me a second to realize what it was. The chair I'd wedged under the door handle was moving. My heart felt like it stopped. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening as the chair scraped against the floor. Then I heard the lock click, and the door creaked open an inch before catching on the chain. Whoever was on the other side didn't try to force it. They just stood there, silent. I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. When the woman answered, I whispered that someone was trying to get into my room. She said she'd send security up immediately. I didn't move until I heard footsteps in the hallway and a man's voice calling out, asking if everything was okay. When I opened the door, there were 2 security guards standing there. I told them what happened, and they checked the hallway, but it was empty. The only thing they found was the chair, still sitting in the middle of the room. I checked out first thing in the morning. The woman at the desk apologized and said she didn't know how it could have happened. She offered me a refund, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. I still don't know who that man was or how he got into the room. The door had been locked, and the only key card should have been mine in the hotel's. But I know what I saw, and I know someone tried to come back later that night. It happened on a Friday evening. I had just put my son to bed, and I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I had ordered some things online earlier that week. Maybe it was a late delivery. I got up and looked through the peephole. A man stood there in a brown jacket holding a small box. He had a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but he smiled when I opened the door, keeping the chain latched. Delivery 4. He glanced at a piece of paper in his hand. Mrs. Taylor? The name was wrong, but I figured maybe it was a mix-up with the delivery company. I think you've got the wrong house, I said. He chuckled nervously. Sorry about that. Could you just confirm the address? That's when I started to feel uneasy. The box didn't have a label on it, and he wasn't wearing any kind of uniform. I asked him which delivery service he was with, but he avoided the question, mumbling something about working with a third-party company. I don't think that's for me, I said, starting to close the door. His hand shot out and grabbed the edge of the door before I could shut it. Wait, he said, his tone changing. I think this might actually be for you. I froze. His smile was gone, and his grip on the door was firm. My heart started pounding, but I tried to stay calm. Let go of the door, I said, trying to sound confident. Instead of listening, he pushed against the door, hard enough to rattle the chain. I leaned my weight against it, but I could feel him testing it, trying to force it open. I just need to come in for a second, he said. His voice was steady, almost too calm, and it scared me more than if he'd been yelling. I'm calling the police, I said, backing away from the door and grabbing my phone off the table. He stopped pushing and looked straight through the gap. You won't, he said, his voice low and even. Something about the way he said it made my stomach drop. I dialed 911 anyway, but before I could hit call, he slammed his shoulder into the door. The chain held, but it groaned under the pressure. I screamed, dropping my phone, and ran to grab the baseball bat I kept in the corner of the living room. Stop it! I yelled, holding the bat in front of me like a shield. He didn't respond. The chain snapped with a loud crack, and the door flew open. He stepped inside, shutting it behind him, and for a second, we just stared at each other. He wasn't tall or particularly muscular, but there was something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. He looked determined. I don't want to hurt you, he said, raising his hands like he was trying to calm me down. Just stay quiet, and this will be over soon. Get out of my house. I screamed, raising the bat. He lunged at me before I could swing it, grabbing my wrists and forcing the bat out of my hands. I struggled against him, kicking and clawing, but he was stronger than he looked. He shoved me against the wall, pinning me there. Where's the kid? He asked, his breath hot against my face. I froze. Leave him alone, I said, my voice shaking. His grip tightened, and he smiled with a slow, deliberate grin that made my skin crawl. That's up to you. I knew I couldn't let him near my son. I'd die before I let that happen. Gathering every ounce of strength I had, I kneed him in the groin as hard as I could. He let out a grunt and stumbled back, giving me just enough time to grab the bat from the floor. This time, I didn't hesitate. I swung it with everything I had, hitting him square in the side. He yelped and fell to his knees, clutching his ribs. I didn't stop. I swung again, this time catching him on the shoulder. He cursed and tried to grab the bat, but I pulled it back and hit him once more, this time in the head. He collapsed onto the floor, groaning, but I didn't wait to see if he was down for good. I ran to the door, unlocked it, and bolted outside, screaming for help. A neighbor heard me and came running. I told him what happened, and he called the police while I stayed on the porch, shaking and trying not to cry. The man didn't come out of the house. By the time the cops arrived, he was unconscious on the floor, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. They took him away in handcuffs, and I later found out he wasn't a delivery driver at all. He'd been scoping out houses in the neighborhood for weeks, pretending to deliver packages as a cover. He had a record breaking and entering assault. That night, I slept in my son's room with the door locked and the bat by my side. I don't think I've ever felt so scared in my life, but I'm just grateful we made it out okay.